Some of our favourite stories we've covered on this channel involve digital crimes, whether it be crypto heists, catfishing, hacking or online scamming. We've compiled the best stories into this marathon for you, so grab some snacks and get comfortable because it's going to be a wild ride. And don't forget to like and subscribe.
And what about this internet thing? Do you know anything about that?
Sure.
It's the late 1990s. The dot-com boom is in full swing and the internet is taking over the world. Ina and David Steiner, a married couple living in the quiet town of Natick, Massachusetts, realized they had valuable knowledge and skills they could share with the world. Ina, a passionate book collector, worked at a publishing company, while David, who had been going to yard sales since he was a kid, was a video producer with a love for antique tools and other collectibles. The couple enjoyed perusing yard sales together, chasing the thrill of finding underpriced treasure. When eBay launched online in 1995, the Steiners were immediately fascinated. 4 years later, the couple started a modest website offering advice to aspiring eBay sellers. They initially called it Auction Bites, but would later rename it to E-commerce Bites. As the internet was still a relatively new invention, and the idea of transacting with strangers online was unfamiliar and a little scary, the Steiners' website quickly became a valuable resource for sellers on eBay as well as Etsy and Amazon. For the next 2 decades, the Steiners poured their heart and souls into growing their website, with a mission to be a conduit for sellers to share their problems and information and give them a voice. David handled the business side of things, while Ina reported on industry news and how it affected sellers. E-commerce Bites tracked trends and policy updates across the industry and became required reading at the highest levels of online selling. The majority of its readers are people who earn their living selling on eBay. The site had grown to an impressive 600,000 loyal readers, and the Steiners became experts in all things eBay. Their knowledge and expertise was so respected that they wrote books on how to develop successful eBay businesses, and Ina was regularly featured on radio shows and in newspapers. The influential website was also noticed by Wall Street and industry observers, and not everyone was too happy with what Ina was writing. It all started in June of 2019, when the Steiners discovered the word Fidomaster spray painted across their pristine white fence in the front yard. Fidomaster was a Twitter user who publicly criticized eBay for treating its sellers unfairly, but the Steiners didn't know him. They couldn't make much sense of it and brushed it off as a teenage prank, not knowing it was just the beginning of a terrifying and relentless intimidation campaign. A few weeks later, they began receiving threatening tweets and direct messages from a newly created Twitter account named Tui Ellie. The Steiners did occasionally receive rude or abusive messages, so they ignored Tui at first, but his messages became increasingly aggressive. On the morning of August 8th, 2019, Ina opened her email to find a flood of sign-ups to various online newsletters, including Irritable Bowel Syndrome News, Satanic Temple Membership, and Sin City Fetish Night. By the end of the day, they had received over 50 such subscriptions. A few days later, they received a message from a courier service asking if they would accept a delivery of a wet specimen. Confused and alarmed, David called the company to ask for more details. It turned out that the wet specimen was a pig fetus embalmed in formaldehyde. David immediately hung up and called the police. An officer arrived to take their statement. The Steiners were convinced that the graffiti, online harassment, and the wet specimen incident were all connected. On his way out, the officer picked up a parcel that had just arrived on the doorstep and handed it to Ina. To their horror, the package contained bloody flesh and hair wrapped in plastic. Ina screamed, but the police officer examined it more closely. It turned out to be a costume pig mask, similar to the one seen in the movie Saw. Just 14 minutes later, Tui Ellie tweeted, "Do I have your attention now?" Over the next few weeks, the Steiners were subjected to a relentless campaign of harassment. David received a padded envelope in the post. Inside it was a book about dealing with the death of a spouse. He took this as a direct death threat to his wife. They received boxes of live cockroaches, spiders, and fly larvae. Late-night pizza deliveries were called to their house, which they had to pay for. Their tormentors even sent pornography addressed to David to their neighbors in an attempt to humiliate him. Craigslist ads appeared for estate sales and swingers parties that listed the Steiners' home address. The ad invited visitors to knock on the Steiners' front door at any time, day or night. Tui Ellie doxed the Steiners' information and his abuse on Twitter became even more graphic and hinted at violence. An expensive funeral wreath showed up at their door, and David was convinced it was another direct death threat against Ina. The Steiners had no idea who could possibly be behind what they believed was psychological warfare. Their home was their sanctuary. The couple purchased it together in 1995 as a fixer-upper, and David spent 10 years almost single-handedly turning it into a unique and comfortable home. They had enjoyed working together from home for over 20 years and didn't travel much, but now they were afraid inside their home, but also too afraid to leave. They didn't know what their tormentors were capable of, and believed things could escalate to someone getting physically harmed or even killed. David installed extra security cameras all over the house, and Ina set up a homemade booby trap, stacking baking pans in front of the back door so they would all crash down if someone entered. For the first time in their marriage, Ina and David slept in separate rooms, so if there was an intruder, at least one of them could escape and get help. David began suffering from panic attacks so severe that they initially thought he was having a heart attack. Neither of them could sleep properly and could no longer go about their day as usual due to exhaustion. One afternoon, David was driving a friend home when he noticed a familiar-looking black van seemed to be following them. The van had New York license plates, and he realized he had seen the van parked on their street before. David and his friend tried to snap a photo of the license plate, but unfortunately, in their panic, were unable to get a clear photo. A couple of days later, David got in the car once more to do a grocery run. He was still shaken from the encounter with the black van, but the household was running out of food and the couple were uncomfortable with ordering delivery service. As David drove, a wave of terror took over as he found himself in the same situation. A silver SUV was following him, but this time, he was determined to get a clear photo. He made a series of random turns, and sure enough, the SUV was still tailing him. David alerted the Natick police and decided to lure the SUV to the police station in case someone dangerous was following him. David stopped his car outside the station and held his phone steady. The SUV drove past, and this time, he was ready. David suffered another panic attack and collapsed outside the police station, unable to walk. But he showed the police his clear photos, and the very next day, police had the identity of the Steiners' stalker. The vehicle that was following David Steiner was a rental under the name Veronica Zay. It didn't take too much digging to discover that Veronica Zay was employed by eBay. In April 2019, Ina published an article about the salary of eBay's then CEO, Devin Wenig. In 2018, he had earned over $18 million, which Ina pointed out was 152 times the average salary of eBay's employees. All of this was publicly available information. The majority of commenters on her article were scathing and critical of Wenig. Back in 2009, the Steiners had discovered that an eBay executive had created fake profiles to leave negative comments on e-commerce sites. eBay had also reported them for phishing, with a PH. eBay later retracted the report, but the damage was done, and the Steiners lost all access to eBay's PR department. Ina, of course, continued her reporting. Ina's April 2019 article about David Wenig's salary was seemingly the final straw for the CEO. He sent a link to the article to Steve Weimer, eBay's then Chief Communications Officer. Steve Weimer immediately replied, "We are going to crush this lady." 1 month later, David Wenig texted back, "Take her down." Steve Weimer and eBay's Senior Director of Safety and Security, Jim Bohr, hatched their plan to take down Ina and David Steiner. "I want to see ashes," Weimer texted Bohr, "as long as it takes, whatever it takes." Jim Bohr was a daunting presence at eBay. He claimed to have worked for the CIA and disliked having his authority questioned. He once found a knife on a barbecue at eBay headquarters, took it, then stabbed it through a chair in front of everyone. He made his employees watch movie scenes of interrogations and executions. Once, he ordered security guards to open up all of the staff lockers and dump the possessions into garbage bags to teach them that there was no privacy at work. Jim Bohr assigned 6 intelligence analysts to his plan to destroy Ina and David Steiner. They made a fake Twitter account and started reaching out to FidoMaster, who Jim Bohr believed to be an account controlled by the Steiners. They tried to bait Fidomaster into giving up information about the Steiners, but they were unsuccessful. In June, Bohr ordered one of his analysts, former police captain Brian Gilbert, to travel to Natick. Gilbert purchased a can of spray paint from a hardware store, then vandalized the Steiners' fence. Jim Bohr and another senior executive, Stephanie Popp, created the Twitter account Tui Ellie to harass the Steiners online, while the rest of the team organized the various deliveries to the Steiners' home. Natick police were able to trace the funeral wreath to a gift card that was purchased at a grocery store just 8 miles away from eBay headquarters in Silicon Valley. Security footage from the store was obtained, and sure enough, Veronica Zay was seen buying the gift card. During this time, Ina Steiner continued her reporting on e-commerce bites, albeit posting less frequently. On August 1st, she published an article about eBay's lawsuit against Amazon for, quote, poaching its sellers. On August 11th, Stephen Weimer egged on Jim Bohr, texting him, "She's a biased troll who needs to get burned down." Jim Bohr, Veronica Zay, and David Harville, another senior leader of the security division, flew first class to Boston, where they stayed at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel to begin the final phase of their plan, physical surveillance. Stephanie Popp also later joined them. They planned to break into the Steiners' garage and install a GPS tracker on their car. The team had even practiced doing so in the eBay parking lot in California. Thankfully, they never got that far into their plan. On August 21st, detectives from Natick Police showed up at the Ritz-Carlton wanting to speak to Veronica Zay. She made up an excuse and then managed to leave Boston with Jim Bohr, but it didn't matter because Natick Police had already put the pieces together and notified the FBI, as well as eBay's legal department. Jim Bohr and his team began a cover-up. They created fake dossiers on Ina and David Steiner to, quote, make them look crazy, to discredit their harassment complaints. They forged documents to make it look like eBay was being threatened by the Steiners. 2 members of the team were former police captains, so they believed they could outwit the Natick police with made-up cover stories. Jim Bohr instructed his team to delete any incriminating material off their phones. Stephanie Popp coached the team to lie to eBay internal investigators. They even compiled a list of names of people from Silicon Valley they could frame if needed. As the FBI investigation progressed, the full breadth of the scheme against the Steiners was revealed. Jim Bohr's strategy was to turn the Steiners' lives upside down to the point that they'd stop publishing e-commerce bites. He directed his team to use prepaid debit cards, disguises, and overseas email accounts to hide their tracks. Then, eBay's security team would swoop in and offer to protect the Steiners and stop whoever was harassing them. The goal was to win the couple's trust so they would no longer publish negative opinions about eBay, and also to give up their identity of Fidomaster, who in reality was not conspiring with the Steiners in any way. The news of the investigation was shocking to the Steiners. Their relationship with eBay was rocky, but they never imagined that this bizarre plot to terrorize them was hatched at the highest level of the multi-billion-dollar company. The motive for the harassment campaign was not totally clear, but it was most likely that eBay's most senior executives were fed up with the nature of Ina's content, as well as all the comments who questioned and criticized the company. eBay concluded its internal investigation in September 2019 and fired all employees involved, including Chief Communications Officer Steve Weimer. However, Devin Wenig was allowed to resign and took home a $57 million exit package. Almost an entire year after the harassment against the Steiners began, Massachusetts U.S. Attorney Andrew Lelling announced the criminal charges against the 6 former eBay employees and contractors.
This was a determined, systematic effort by senior employees of a major company to destroy the lives of a couple in Natick, all because they published content the company executives didn't like.
Jim Bohr and David Harville were both arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit cyberstalking and conspiracy to tamper with witnesses. The other 4 were charged with the same crimes but were not arrested. A 7th former employee was later charged the following month. The ringleader, Jim Bohr, eBay's former senior director of safety and security, pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. At his sentencing, Bohr accepted full responsibility and asked the Steiners for forgiveness. Second in command, David Harville, was sentenced to 2 years in prison, while everyone else was sentenced to less time or are still awaiting sentencing. Meanwhile, at the top, Devin Wenig and Steve Weimer were both relatively unscathed. Although Weimer was fired, it was only a few months before he became the CEO of Silicon Valley Boys and Girls Clubs, which are after-school programs in the United States. Devin Wenig denied any knowledge or approval of the stalking scheme and claimed that his "take her down" message was not a command to commit criminal acts. He is currently serving on the board of directors at General Motors. Ina and David Steiner have since filed a civil lawsuit against eBay and hope to hold the company's former leaders accountable, as well as get more answers regarding their motives. The Steiners are still recovering from the weeks of constant harassment, stalking, and threats at the hands of the company's former employees. They are now hyper-vigilant when they go out and suffer from intense anxiety every time a parcel arrives or if a stranger approaches their home. Despite this, the couple is still committed to covering e-commerce news and helping online sellers succeed, and have no plans to stop. They have also been speaking out for the protection of rights and safety of journalists.
It's the morning of May 5th, 2000, a Friday. You wake up, go about your usual morning routine, looking forward to the weekend ahead. You arrive at work, 9 to 5 at a nondescript corporate office. You greet your colleagues in neighboring cubicles as you set your things down and turn your computer on. You wait patiently for your computer to connect to the internet via dial-up modem. Your emails finally load. A message from an old flame catches your eye. The subject reads, "I love you." Your heart races and you quickly open the email. "Kindly check the attached love letter coming from me," it reads. You briefly wonder why the love letter wasn't just written in the body of the email, but you're too curious to question it further. You click on the attachment, a .txt file. Nothing happens. You try double-clicking. Again, nothing happens. Before you can figure out why the text file won't open, your coworker in the next cubicle pops his head over and asks why you've just sent him a love letter email. Your blood runs cold. You look around the office. All of your coworkers are staring at you. You look back down at your computer screen, but it's gone black. Whatever it was that you opened crashed your computer and had just spread to every single one of your email contacts. When the Y2K bug didn't trigger the apocalypse at the end of the 20th century, the world quickly moved on from the prospect of a computer glitch that could destroy modern society. Back then, the average person's computer literacy was low to non-existent, and the majority of the world didn't even have internet access. The use of email was becoming more popular, but it was nothing like what it is today. Before there were websites like Gmail, Microsoft Outlook was the default program people used for emails. Companies would host their websites and emails off of the same server, and usually didn't have much in place to protect their systems from outside infiltration. Spam filters didn't really exist because spam didn't really exist yet. On the 4th of May 2000, email users across Hong Kong began to receive a strange message in their inboxes, seemingly a love note from someone they knew. They all contained the same message: "Kindly check the attached love letter coming from me," along with what appeared to be a text file. However, upon clicking the attachment, users were not met with a declaration of love, but instead, numerous files on their computer would get corrupted. The .txt file was actually a .vbs file. Once opened, it would automatically run a script that searched the computer's drives for JPEGs, CSS files, docs, and other files, and overwrote them with copies of itself. As you can imagine, the practice of backing up files wasn't really a thing in the year 2000. The average person didn't have separate external drives and cloud storage didn't exist. So as a result, photos, spreadsheets, documents, and other important files that weren't backed up on separate storage were lost. For unknown reasons, the worm only hid MP3s instead of overwriting them, so at least your audio files were safe. As well as disappearing a whole bunch of your files, the malware would also automatically send out the love letter email to your entire contact list. This is what caused it to spread across the globe so rapidly. The sender of the email appeared to come from someone you knew. There were no spam filters, and human curiosity would take over. And in just 5 hours, the I love you worm or love bug had ravaged computers in Asia, Europe, then North America. Hong Kong was hit particularly hard due to its close geographical proximity to the virus's origin, which we'll get into soon. The Dow Jones Newswire, the real-time provider of stock market updates, went offline, as well as several investment banks. Some people did realize something was off when they received identical emails from different people, but all it took was a few individuals at each company to take the bait to completely crash servers. The worm then traveled westward as Europe began its working day. The Danish Parliament was one of the first major entities to go offline, before the UK Parliament's email system also crashed. It was estimated that 10 to 30% of UK businesses were hit by the worm, including large companies like BT and Vodafone, and ironically, Microsoft. Universities and government institutions like the NHS and City of London were also struck. Asia and Europe tried to get word out to American offices before they woke up, but it was too little, too late. Countless email users, including employees at Ford, AT&T, Merrill Lynch, and even the Pentagon, opened what they thought was a love letter, only to cause the collapse of their email servers. It is estimated that 1/10 of the world's email servers went down, and over 45 million computers were affected in total. Cybersecurity firms were inundated with desperate requests for help, but once files were lost, they were usually gone for good. Important information like financial records and military documents were affected. The FBI estimated that the total damages worldwide cost $8 to $10 billion. So who or what was behind all this? What was the purpose of this love bug? Tracing the origin of the I love you worm turned out to be a pretty simple process. Firstly, every single computer that got infected with the virus ended up with copies of the code. This made it easy for antivirus services to roll out patches and prevent further damage. The code itself was unsophisticated and consisted of snippets from other existing malware. The code made no attempts to conceal how it worked, and because it was written in Visual Basic Script, VBS, it meant anyone could edit it. Within hours, more than 25 copycats of the I love you worm emerged and spread across the internet. Most of them had changed up their email subject and message, or tweaked the code so more critical files would be overwritten and render many computers completely unbootable. The code also contained a few clues pointing to who its creator was. In the first line was a sentiment many of us have probably expressed at some stage. I hate go to school. Perhaps the coder was a student? In the next line was a Philippines-based email address, as well as a reference to a Gramasoft group. The Philippine National Bureau of Investigation, NBI, was contacted by Manila-based internet service provider, Sky Internet. After the worm had first been unleashed, Sky Internet received numerous complaints from overseas IT workers. The virus was skimming passwords off victims' computers and sending them to a server hosted by the ISP. Sky Internet had promptly taken the server down, but that didn't stop the worm from deleting millions of files all over the world. This was a clue to what its creator's motive was though, to steal internet account passwords. 4 days later, the NBI tracked the email address and phone number to a small apartment in Quezon City, Manila, owned by Irene de Guzman. Her partner, 27-year-old Riomel Ramones, was arrested. Investigators seized computer magazines, phones, floppy disks, cables, and cassette tapes, but they did not find an actual computer. They also did not find the third resident of the apartment, Irene's younger brother, Onel de Guzman. A few hours before officers across Asia were crippled by the love bug, 23-year-old Onel de Guzman was contemplating a last-minute decision. Onel was the youngest of 4 children. He grew up extremely poor, but developed an interest in computers from an early age. He would spend hours at bookstores reading about computers, and then started hanging around in internet cafes to learn from technicians and other IT enthusiasts. His passion for all things computing led him to enroll at the AMA Computer College in Quezon City. He excelled in his classes and started a side hustle building and selling PCs. Most people at his college hoped to graduate with enough qualifications to get an IT job overseas, but Onel was talented and wanted to push the limits. He started experimenting with hacking into people's PCs and stealing internet accounts, then eventually started a secret club called Gramasoft with a few of his like-minded classmates. Onel had recently submitted his final thesis, Email Password Sender Trojan, but it had been rejected and deemed unethical. He had argued that internet access was a human right, so he proposed a program that would steal Windows passwords so he could use internet accounts that people had already paid for. At the time, computers were not widely used in the Philippines, and dial-up internet was expensive. O'Neill included some of the code for his proposed Trojan virus in his thesis, but his professor dismissed the whole thing as illegal. O'Neill dropped out soon after that, but continued to tinker with his code. In early May 2000, O'Neill decided to make some changes to his virus. He originally only wanted to target Manila, since only Manila's dial-up internet passwords would work with his phone line. But at the last minute, he decided to get rid of that restriction out of sheer curiosity. O'Neill also needed a way for the virus to spread, so he could obtain as many passwords as possible. First, he programmed the virus to mass send a copy of itself to every single person in his victim's email address book. Then, he needed to somehow entice his victims to actually run the script. He figured, what's the one thing that all humans desire? He named the file loveletterforyou.txt. He exploited a feature in the Windows system at the time that hid some file extensions by default. The .txt extension in the name was fake, and the real file type VBS was hidden. His victims would click on what they thought was a harmless text file, most likely too puzzled or excited to realize they were actually about to run a highly infectious virus. At 1 AM on the 4th of May, O'Neill sent his creation to his first victim, an acquaintance in Singapore he chatted with occasionally. He then went out to get drinks with some friends before heading to bed, totally oblivious to the pandemonium that would ensue. 4 days later, O'Neill was the NBI's #1 suspect. He had been laying low since news first broke of the catastrophic virus. He was terrified and completely helpless, unable to stop his virus's path of destruction. His ISP, Sky Internet, had shut down his servers within hours of I Love You's release, so he never even got to use any of his stolen Windows passwords. He had hidden his computer before the police searched the apartment, but accidentally left some incriminating floppy disks behind. His name had been mentioned all over the news. It was time to lawyer up. Except the NBI didn't actually know what crime to charge O'Neill and Riomel Ramones with. The Philippines didn't have any laws for cybercrimes yet. At first, they considered charging the pair with credit card fraud because they used stolen prepaid internet cards, but that didn't quite work. The NBI settled on charging O'Neill and Riomel with malicious mischief, a felony crime involving intentional damage to property. There was enough evidence to prove that O'Neill was the perpetrator, but the Philippines Department of Justice dismissed the charges because Sky Internet, the ISP, was the only private complainant, and there was no evidence to suggest O'Neill intended to cause damage to them specifically. After the case was dropped in the Philippines, the United States was unable to extradite him for prosecution. O'Neill de Guzman walked away from the whole thing without punishment. On May 11, 2000, a press conference was held in Quezon City, Manila. O'Neill moped into a small room to front the reporters and cameras, his sister Irene by his side. He dabbed his sweaty face with a white handkerchief. O'Neill didn't speak much English, so his lawyer Rolando Quimbo did most of the talking. He asserted that O'Neill was not involved in the crimes he had been accused of. When asked if the virus was released by accident, O'Neill mumbled, "It is possible." The lead investigator at the NBI, Nelson Bartolome, conceded they did not know it was criminal. Perhaps it was just a prank. In July 2000, the Philippine Congress hastily enacted a new Electronic Commerce Act that covered laws around electronic transactions, interference with computers, unauthorized access to information, etc. O'Neill gave a few interviews over the next couple of years in an attempt to cling onto his newfound notoriety. He defended hackers and touted his belief that information on the internet should be freely available to everyone. However, he never outright admitted to creating I Love You, now that the Philippines had new laws in place. He suggested to the San Francisco Chronicle that a college friend or possibly his sister had messed around on his computer and accidentally unleashed the virus. The New York Times reported that there was a sense of national pride in the Philippines surrounding the whole saga. Some Filipino tech pundits felt that the love bug finally shone a light on the nation's burgeoning IT industry and welcomed the publicity. In 2020, investigative journalist Jeff White interviewed Onel de Guzman and detailed their encounter in his book, Crime.com, From Viruses to Vote Rigging, How Hacking Went Global. Onel had gone quiet in the last 2 decades. He had absolutely zero public online presence. There were rumors that he worked for the UN or Microsoft, but Jeff White tracked him down to a mobile phone repair shop in a busy market in the Quiapo district of Manila. Now, aged 43, Onel was happy to come clean about everything. He had simply been a poor but ambitious young man who never could have imagined the impact his creation would have had on the world. Back in 2000, Riomel Ramones, along with several AMA college students, had also been named as suspects, but Onel admitted that he was the only person behind the I Love You worm all along. Onel said he regrets ever writing the virus, especially now that he has 2 kids who don't yet know about his past. How did Dr. Ruja Ignatova end up as the only woman on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list? She was Oxford educated, spoke 5 languages, lived in a London penthouse, and had given birth to her daughter just 1 year before she disappeared. So what happened? Why did this accomplished entrepreneur go on the run, and where is she now? Ruja Ignatova was born in 1980 in Bulgaria, where her father was an engineer and her mother was a teacher. In 1990, Ruja and her family moved to Germany after the fall of the Iron Curtain. They moved into a small apartment above a butcher, and Ruja's father got a job working at a tire shop. At school, Ruja excelled academically, but not so much socially. She didn't have many friends. Her habit of wearing high heels and bright red lipstick to school made her an outcast, but Ruja didn't care. She felt that she was destined for far greater things. At age 18, Ruja won a scholarship to the prestigious Konstanz University, referred to as the Harvard of Germany, and earned a doctorate in law in 2005. There she met fellow law student Bjorn Strell, and the two soon got married. Ruja went on to earn a master's degree in comparative European law from Oxford, while her husband practiced real estate law. In 2008, Dr. Ruja moved back to Bulgaria to work as a consultant at McKinsey & Co., but was laid off a year later when the global financial crisis hit. She landed on her feet and got a job at an investment bank. Ruja was making a name for herself in the world of finance, but she wasn't satisfied. She wanted to create something of her own and get filthy rich off it. She considered launching her own beauty brand, but then crypto came along and she immediately knew this was her chance. In November 2013, Ruja spoke at a crypto seminar in Singapore and shared her ideas about crypto-based pension plans. The concept didn't garner much interest, but it didn't matter because what she gained at that seminar was far more valuable: her future business partner. Sebastian Greenwood was impressed by Ruja and approached her at the seminar. He pitched her an idea: a multi-level marketing cryptocurrency business. Sebastian had worked for his parents' advertising agency in his home country of Sweden before working at KPMG in Germany. He had some experience working in the burgeoning industry of digital currencies, but was eager to launch something of his own. In early 2014, Ruja and Sebastian launched OneCoin. They wanted to set their cryptocurrency apart from the rest. Their company OneLife was focused on attracting as many investors as possible using multi-level marketing, or MLM. Ruja and Sebastian were the top level. They hired a small team of experienced MLM salespeople to sell their cryptocurrency packages and invest in OneCoin. These salespeople were the next level down. Every new person that joined was encouraged to spread the word about OneCoin and sell the packages themselves to earn a commission. Every new member recruited and all the new people they recruited formed a downline, and everyone on the levels above them all received a commission from the sales made below them. Since Ruja and Sebastian were at the very top level, they earned a cut of every single sale. Yes, there is another term for a business model like this. The OneLife marketing strategy was simple. They preyed on people's Bitcoin FOMO. Bitcoin had boomed at the end of 2013, and there were countless stories of early investors who became millionaires overnight. There was no shortage of people who felt like they had missed the boat and were now looking for the next big thing in crypto. That's where OneCoin swooped in. Dr. Ruja Ignatova became the face of OneCoin. She was the perfect mascot. People loved her backstory. She was an undisputedly smart, self-made woman with an impressive resume in law and finance. She spoke 5 languages and claimed to have an IQ of 200. She gave presentations around the world, always blinged out and wearing her signature bold lipstick. She projected an image of success and knew all the right buzzwords to appeal to the masses who wanted to get rich quick off of crypto, but didn't know how. The big selling point was OneCoin is not like the other coins. Bitcoin, the most popular cryptocurrency, was associated with the dark web and shady individuals who wanted their online transactions to be anonymous. Ruja wanted to distance OneCoin from that perception. In fact, she called OneCoin the Bitcoin killer. She boasted about OneCoin's transparency and safety. She explained jargon like what the blockchain is, a digital record of every single crypto transaction that could not be edited by anyone. She ensured members that all user data on OneCoin's private blockchain was encrypted to prevent theft and money laundering. Plus, there was a team of compliance lawyers and independent auditors to further protect everyone's money. Of course, she didn't mention that every other cryptocurrency's blockchain was actually publicly available. Ruja didn't see OneCoin simply as an asset. She saw a world where one day, everyone would be using OneCoin for everyday purchases. She called it a borderless payment system and called for potential investors to join the financial revolution and conquer the world with her. At her presentations, Ruja emphasized how lucky her audience was to be joining her movement so early and promised buyers a 5 or 10-fold return on their investment. OneLife had a variety of crypto packages for sale. They ranged in price from €100 to 118,000 euros. The packages included access to different levels of One Academy online courses, as well as tokens that could be used to mine OneCoins. The more expensive packages allowed members to access special computers and mining pools that mine coins at a higher rate. Investors would then hold onto their OneCoins and watch them grow in value right before their eyes. Believing they were about to be rich beyond their wildest dreams, members would recruit their friends and family to join, who then in turn convinced their friends and family, and so on and so forth. Ruja promised that OneCoins could eventually be turned back into fiat money, like dollars, euros, or pounds, or they could be used to buy and sell goods on OneLife's soon-to-be-launched merchant platform. The aggressive marketing strategy worked. Ruja's passion was infectious, and her vision captured the attention of millions of people around the world. By mid-2016, Ruja claimed that OneCoin had 10 times as many investors as Bitcoin. OneLife conventions became bigger and more extravagant. Ruja made appearances in cities around the world: Las Vegas, Tokyo, Kuala Lumpur, Dubai, always wearing a couture gown and dripping with diamonds. She would make exciting announcements about the new features like CoinSafe, which was essentially a high-interest savings account or a rebuilt and improved blockchain. She'd also reward her long-term followers by doubling their OneCoins. Her legion of fans hung on to her every word, enamored by her brilliance, hypnotized by the promise of wealth. Most of them didn't fully understand the technical in and outs of this new technology, but Dr. Ruja was educated and had her own relatable rags to riches backstory. There was no need to think too deeply about the complicated computer stuff. Their fearless leader, aka the Crypto Queen, had it all covered. If the worshipping of Ruja wasn't cult-like enough, her followers also began throwing up this hand symbol to further create an us versus them mentality. Ruja and the company's higher-ups weren't shy about flaunting their newfound wealth. OneLife got its own private company jet, and the top salespeople began showing up in new sports cars. Ruja's collection of jewelry and designer bags expanded, and she filled her new £13 million London penthouse with expensive art. She added a Dubai apartment plus a sprawling waterfront mansion in her native Bulgaria to her property portfolio. She also splurged on a €7 million super yacht. Every tacky rich person cliche you can think of, these guys did it. Dr. Ruja's opulent birthday bashes were documented on her company's YouTube channel. In 2016, her birthday party was held in London's iconic Victoria and Albert Museum, and Tom Jones performed. Ruja's image was extremely important. The more luxuries she surrounded herself with, the more people believed that OneCoin was the ticket to their own wealth. Ruja wasn't just the face of the company. She was what investors were buying into. A brilliant, confident, glamorous, mega wealthy crypto queen. Remember how I said that Ruja wanted OneCoin to stand out from all other cryptocurrencies? Well, there was one huge glaring difference. OneCoin was not actually a cryptocurrency at all. Back in 2013, Sebastian Greenwood had pitched Ruja the idea of a multi-level marketing business model to grow their own cryptocurrency. Sebastian didn't come up with this idea on his own though. He had already been involved in an MLM/Ponzi scheme based in Hong Kong, selling a non-existent crypto called Bitcoin. Very creative name, I know. He brought Ruja in, but the scheme collapsed in about a year, as all Ponzi schemes eventually do. Sebastian and Ruja believed they were a better team than the founders of the short-lived Bitcoin, so they essentially repackaged the business model and named it OneCoin. MLMs are legal in most countries, but pyramid schemes are not. The difference is that there is no legitimate product being sold in a pyramid scheme. The focus is more so on recruiting new members and selling the promise of big returns. The products that One Life sold were shiny OneCoin token packages and online courses. However, OneCoin was not a real cryptocurrency, and the courses turned out to be plagiarized from a bunch of sources including Wikipedia. So therefore, One Life was not selling a legitimate product. The whole thing was one giant pyramid scheme, with Dr. Ruja and Sebastian Greenwood sitting at the top. There was no coin exchange, there was no mining pool, and there was certainly no blockchain. The coin's price or value were just made up, totally arbitrary numbers that had nothing to do with market supply and demand. OneCoin's value never once decreased between 2014 to 2019 because its value was being manually adjusted. In reality, OneCoin was completely worthless. The business was also a Ponzi scheme because money invested by new recruits was used to pay back previous investors. Ponzi schemes are very much illegal and always collapse. Ruja and Sebastian knew this. They had started hatching an exit strategy on the 9th of August 2014. Ruja had emailed her business partner, take the money and run, and blame someone else for this. From day one, Ruja and Sebastian had cooked up their fake crypto to defraud everyday people. They referred to it in emails as trashy coin. Sebastian called their victims idiots, to which Ruja responded, "As you told me, the network would not work with intelligent people, winky face." On the 11th of August 2014, Sebastian wrote to Ruja, "Get members to think that they are mining their OneCoin via crunching tokens for OneCoin." Ruja replied, "We are not mining actually, but telling people shit." On the 15th of March 2015, Ruja proposed we can manipulate the exchange by simulating some volatility and intraday pricing. Always close on a high price, build confidence, better manipulation so they are happy. Their emails revealed that they had full control over OneCoin's supposed value, and they were using crypto concepts like mining to trick their victims into thinking it was real. The so-called compliance lawyers didn't do anything, and the team of auditors came from a fake company. OneCoin's super safe encrypted blockchain simply didn't exist. All the fake coins that were being fake mined were being kept track of on a database that Ruja and Sebastian controlled. In just 2 years, the OneCoin scheme raked in over $4 billion USD from 3.5 million victims from every corner of the globe. Things began to unravel for Ruja in 2016. Crypto was well and truly mainstream by now, and investors and skeptics were starting to ask questions. The main one being, what's up with OneCoin's blockchain? In February, journalist Andrew Penman wrote in the UK's Daily Mirror about how OneCoin was a bit fishy. Later that year, Norwegian blockchain developer Bjorn Björk was headhunted by OneCoin and was offered the role of Chief Technology Officer. He was asked to build a blockchain. However, he was confused how a cryptocurrency had been operating all these years without a blockchain. He turned the job down, then discovered that there had been some speculation online about OneCoin being a scam. Authorities in Bulgaria, Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Latvia were keeping an eye on One Life and warning the public to avoid them. In 2017, authorities in India, Germany, Thailand, and Vietnam also began to crack down on OneCoin activities. However, Ruja's ultimate undoing would come from someone very close to her. Gilbert Armenta was a Florida-based financier who had been helping Ruja build relationships with banks in the United States since mid-2015. Ruja regularly asked him to open new bank accounts under his name to move around hundreds of millions of dollars to pay out commissions. She never provided details about these transfers, but Gilbert didn't ask too many questions. He just did as he was asked. He too had fallen under Ruja's spell, and they soon started having an affair. Gilbert actually had no idea that OneCoin was a scam, but he had been involved in unrelated money laundering and paying bribes in the past, and as a result was being watched by the United States Department of Justice. On the 13th of September 2017, Gilbert Armenta was arrested. He immediately took a deal and cooperated with the DOJ in exchange for a lighter sentencing. He spent the next 14 days in a hotel room with federal agents and gave them access to all his emails and answered all of their questions about OneCoin and One Life. He told them everything he knew about Ruja. Meanwhile, Ruja had been tipped off that her boyfriend was ratting her out. On the 25th of October 2017, she boarded a Ryanair flight from Sofia, Bulgaria, landed in Athens, Greece, and has not been seen since. In her wake, Ruja left her husband, her younger brother, and her business partner to face the looming criminal investigation. She also left her 3.5 million victims high and dry. Ruja was charged in absentia with 1 count each of wire fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, securities fraud, and conspiracy to commit money laundering, each of which carries a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison. She was also charged with 1 count of conspiracy to commit securities fraud, which carries a maximum 5-year sentence. Ruja seems to have disappeared off the face of the planet, but BBC journalists Jamie Bartlett and Georgia Catt spent 4 years speaking to hundreds of people all around the world and were able to put together a theory about her movements and current whereabouts. After landing in Athens, it is believed that Ruja was smuggled back to Bulgaria. However, in January 2018, German police raided the OneCoin office in Sofia, so she likely left Europe soon after. There were multiple reports of sightings in Dubai in 2018, plus posts from her brother Konstantin's Instagram at the time also placed him in Dubai. But she most likely fled again once Dubai was no longer safe either. Back in 2015, Ruja had made a deal with the UAE royal. She gave the sheikh ownership of one of her companies in exchange for 230,000 bitcoins. But the 50 million euros in that company's account had since been frozen after she became an international fugitive. The theory is that she took her bitcoins, now worth 10 billion USD, and is living on a luxury yacht out on international waters. The FBI has suggested that Ruja may have undergone extensive cosmetic surgeries to completely change her appearance. Some internet detectives believe that Ruja may have been present at the 2019 Miss One Life beauty pageant in Romania. There have also been reports from hospitality staff and yacht crews around the south of France and Mediterranean of a woman who looked like Ruja, who talked about crypto a lot. In January 2023, Ruja's London penthouse was listed for sale by German prosecutors in an attempt to recover funds to compensate Ruja's victims, but has since been taken off the market. Ruja's Bitcoin activity is not trackable, and as of this video's upload, she remains at large. The FBI is offering a reward of up to $250,000 for information leading to her arrest. As for the rest of the characters in this story, Sebastian Greenwood, OneCoin's co-founder and Ruja's right-hand man, was arrested in 2018 from his home in Koh Samui, Thailand. He was extradited to the US and pleaded guilty to wire fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and conspiracy to launder money. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison and fined 300 million USD for orchestrating what US Attorney Damian Williams called one of the largest fraud schemes ever perpetrated. Bjorn Strell, Ruja's husband, had always kept a low profile but accompanied Ruja to most of her events. After she fled, he returned to Germany to lay low, but was eventually charged with money laundering in May 2023. It is unclear what happened to their daughter, who was born in October 2016. Konstantin Ignatov, Ruja's younger brother and personal assistant, took over the business at the end of 2017. He continued to run the operation until he was arrested in March 2019. He took a plea deal and testified against One Life's lawyer, Mark Scott. American lawyer Mark Scott, who used attorney-client privilege to hide his communications with Ruja from authorities. He was convicted of money laundering in November 2019. He admitted to funneling $400 million out of the United States. Irina Dilkinska, One Life's head of legal and compliance, pleaded guilty to money laundering in November 2023 and admitted to running the company's day-to-day operations, including funneling over $100 million to offshore bank accounts. Gilbert Armenta, Ruja's former lover who turned against her, was sentenced to 5 years prison for money laundering a total of $300 million. The British Post Office scandal. I know what you're thinking. Sounds like a snooze fest. But this case has been described as the most widespread miscarriage of justice in UK history. It's a story about an error that destroyed hundreds of innocent lives. It's a story about corporate greed and a shocking cover-up attempt. It's a legal drama full of twists and turns, usually only seen on TV. It's an ongoing, decades-long battle for justice. The digital revolution of the late 1990s saw institutions and individuals all around the world scrambling to introduce computers to daily life, including the UK Post Office. There are approximately 12,000 post office retail branches in the UK where you can do more than just mail letters. You can do your banking there, pay your bills, collect your benefits, buy lottery tickets, as well as shop for everyday goods. In the small, isolated villages of the UK, the post office branch could also be a vital community hub, and sub-postmasters, the self-employed men and women who run the office, were well-respected members of the community. Paperwork was filled out by hand, and sub-postmasters were responsible for balancing the books manually. For clarity, the publicly owned UK Post Office Company will be referred to as Post Office Limited in this video. In 1999, Post Office Limited commissioned tech corporation Fujitsu to custom design an accounting computer for all of its post office branches. This computer, dubbed Horizon, was warmly received by sub-postmasters who believed it would make their jobs much easier. However, the rollout was less than smooth. A technician would come to install the new computer, then a trainer would stay for a day or two to show post office staff how to use it. Many sub-postmasters of this time were still getting used to using computers at all, so the training wasn't really enough for them to master this complicated accounting machine. Almost immediately, sub-postmasters around the UK were having issues balancing the books on Horizon. There was a phone hotline to call when post office staff needed help with Horizon, but the operators were often unhelpful and disinterested. Sometimes their advice would lead to even greater discrepancies in the numbers. Former sub-postmaster Alan Bates was tech-savvy and had an existing interest in computers, so he was excited when the Horizon computer arrived at his post office in Craigydon, North Wales. However, just a few months in, the computer began displaying a £6,000 shortfall in the post office's balance. Alan double-checked everything, then had an unhelpful conversation with the hotline, so he decided to take matters into his own hands and began poking around in the computer. He discovered that there were several inexplicable duplicate transactions in the system. After examining as many of the post office's transactions as he could and deleting the duplicates, he managed to reduce the discrepancy to £1,000. Alan was asked to pay back the £1,000, but he refused as he knew there were more errors on the computer. When Alan requested more access to the computer's data, Post Office Limited gave him 3 months' notice and terminated his contract. Alan didn't know it at the time, but he was just one of many other sub-postmasters who were struggling with Horizon and receiving no help from Post Office Limited. In fact, Alan was actually one of the lucky ones.
Between 1999 and 2015, Post Office Limited prosecuted over 700 innocent people for theft, fraud, and false accounting. Ordinary people were convicted and some even thrown into prison for crimes they did not commit. Over 2 decades later, the majority of them are still fighting for justice. Post office branches all over the UK were losing money because of Horizon bugs, and the powers that be were unwilling to accept that the computer could be capable of mistakes and would demand the money get paid back. Joe Hamilton, the former sub-postmaster of the tiny village of South Warnborough, was told that her wages would be withheld until she could pay back the discrepancy in her post office's balance. Joe was terrified of getting into trouble for being unable to produce the correct balance. So she secretly remortgaged her house, then put her own money into the post office till, but it wasn't enough. She didn't know what to do. Her Horizon computer was still saying that thousands of pounds were missing. She was running out of money and had no choice but to sign off on the incorrect accounting. By 2005, the hole in the South Warnborough Post Office's account had grown to £36,000. Auditors paid her a visit and, to her horror, accused her of stealing the money and issued her a summons to appear in court. She took a deal to plead guilty to false accounting and was ordered to pay back the £36,000. Joe was given a 12-month supervision order and managed to avoid any prison time thanks to the support and glowing character references from the villagers of South Warnborough, who also helped raise the £36,000. But she now had a criminal record and was completely out of money. In 2003, Lee Castleton bought a post office in Bridlington, but within a year, his Horizon computer showed a £25,000 shortfall. Suspecting there was some kind of computer error, he called the hotline 91 times. Instead of helping, Post Office Limited took Lee to court. He couldn't afford a lawyer and was forced to repay the shortfall, as well as cover £321,000 in legal costs. His post office shop was shut down. He sold his house and had to move his family as his children were getting bullied. Seema Misra bought a post office in West Byfleet in 2005. Seema had experience working as a treasurer, so she thought it was odd when she couldn't get the Horizon computer to balance the books from day one. A few months later, auditors showed up and told her that the £4,000 discrepancy would be deducted from her salary. In early 2008, an audit found a £75,000 shortfall, and Seema was suspended and charged. She was confident that the truth would prevail, so she was in total shock when a jury found her guilty of theft and she was sentenced to 15 months prison. Seema said the only thing that stopped her from taking her own life was the fact that she was pregnant. Harjinder Bhutoy and his wife Balbinder ran the post office in Sutton in Ashfield. In 2008, he was convicted of stealing £200,000 and endured 18 months behind bars. He lost his home, had to declare bankruptcy, and his post office was shut down. His false conviction made it difficult to find work after he was released. Janet Skinner had been a sub-postmaster in Hull since 1994. Like many of her colleagues, she was having difficulty getting her new Horizon computer to balance, and a £59,000 shortfall landed her in prison for 9 months. When investigators from Post Office Limited visited Siobhan Sayers' North Norfolk home, she gladly let them in as she had nothing to hide. She thought they could help her with the computer problem she'd been having at work, but they had actually come to search for a missing £18,000 and turned her home upside down in the process. Her distressed 6-month-old baby started crying, but the investigators didn't allow Siobhan to tend to her. Siobhan was given a 40-week suspended sentence and ordered to do 200 hours of community service after being convicted of fraud. Martin Griffiths had worked as a sub-postmaster in Ellesmere Port for 20 years. Soon after the Horizon computer arrived in his post office branch, auditors began to hound him for a £60,000 shortfall. Martin went into his own personal savings and asked his parents for money to try and make up for the deficit that eventually grew to £100,000. In May 2013, 2 armed robbers attacked the branch, breaking Martin's hands and stealing £54,000. A few months later, Martin Griffiths took his own life.
Sadly, 3 other suicides have been directly linked to the Horizon scandal. All around the UK, hundreds of post office staff were going through similar nightmares. Their stories all contained a common thread. They would reach out to Post Office Limited for help, only to be told that the Horizon computer was robust and they would have to come up with the money to cover any shortfalls. They were also told that they were alone, that they were the only ones struggling with Horizon. Then, instead of trying to get to the root of the problem, Post Office Limited went after their own employees, dragged them through a living hell of legal and financial problems, destroyed livelihoods, ruined good names, and inflicted severe emotional and mental turmoil. By early 2004, over 250 sub-postmasters had been prosecuted by Post Office Limited. A few cases had been covered by local media, and word began to spread. When Alan Bates learned that other people had gone through a similar ordeal as he had, he set up postofficevictims.org.uk to collect stories, offer support, and form a united front. At the end of 2009, the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance held their first meeting. They were ready to fight back. In 2012, Jo Hamilton, one of the leading members of the Alliance, had gotten the attention of her Member for Parliament, James Arbuthnot, who was instrumental in rallying up support from other MPs around the UK. Alliance numbers had grown to about 150 people, and with backing from MPs, Post Office Limited couldn't ignore the issue any longer. The first meeting between Alliance members and senior staff of Post Office Limited wasn't the dramatic showdown you might be picturing. The company's chair and board members politely listened to what Alan Bates and co had to say, and expressed that they wanted to resolve the matter. They insisted that Horizon wasn't to blame, but agreed to conduct an independent inquiry. Second Sight, a forensic accounting firm, was commissioned to investigate. Second Sight was promised unrestricted access to all relevant documents and records, including to data that Alan Bates and other sub-postmasters had been requesting to see for years. In July 2013, Second Sight published its first report and confirmed what sub-postmasters had been saying for years, that Horizon was buggy as hell, and Post Office Limited jumped to the conclusion that the missing money was stolen. Ron Warmington, Second Sight director, had also uncovered evidence of intimidation and bullying of sub-postmasters, baseless accusations of theft, and general unprofessional conduct by Post Office Limited. The report's conclusion: Post Office Limited was focused on recovering assets by any means necessary, rather than figuring out why there were so many reports of computer issues. In response, Post Office Limited announced a mediation scheme that would assess individual cases with the help of Second Sight. It felt like a win for the sub-postmasters. However, after a couple of years of fairly civil mediation, Post Office Limited did a 180. They abruptly stopped cooperating and took on a different stance, flatly rejecting any blame for financial losses suffered by sub-postmasters. It was clear what happened. As the truth became close to coming out, Post Office Limited wanted to avoid liability. Those who had been falsely convicted were notified that their applications for mediation were no longer going to be considered. Post Office Limited also stopped providing Second Sight with requested material and became very slow at replying to communications, if they replied at all. On the 8th of April 2015, just one day before Second Sight's final report was due to be published, Post Office Limited fired the firm, made the unpublished report confidential, and ordered the destruction of documents. It was a devastating blow. It felt like years of work and campaigning had just gone down the drain. This was an active attempt at a cover-up. The sub-postmasters wanted to escalate things and seek justice at the High Court, but it was going to be a very expensive process. In November 2010, BBC radio journalist Nick Wallace was contacted by Devinder Misra, the husband of Seema, who had just spent a week in prison. Nick Wallace was intrigued by the Misra's story. He began to investigate and discovered that there were hundreds of postal workers all over the UK who had been convicted for crimes they insisted they did not commit. Nick Wallace followed the story closely over the next several years, culminating in an episode of Panorama that would finally put some pressure on Post Office Limited. The episode aired in August 2015 and didn't hold back. Nick Wallace had dug up minutes from a meeting between Post Office Limited and Fujitsu that was held just before Seema Misra's trial. There was a discussion about a bug in the Horizon system that affected how money was calculated. This was solid proof that the higher-ups actually were aware of their faulty system. Quote, "This could impact upon ongoing legal cases where branches are disputing the integrity of Horizon data." Then, a whistleblower from Fujitsu, Richard Roll, revealed that Horizon had remote access capability all along, meaning an IT worker could have remotely assisted postal staff as well as fixed up any discrepancies in just a few clicks. Almost every sub-postmaster had reached out for help at some point, and were all told that they were on their own, which simply wasn't true. After the Panorama episode aired, more sub-postmasters came forward with their stories. It also caused public outrage. The issue was finally getting mainstream attention. Alan Bates and the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance were now ready to fight in the High Court. They found a law firm, Freeths, that would take on the case, and a third-party litigation fund, Therium, that would front their costs. They gathered a total of 550 sub-postmaster claimants. The group litigation, also known as a class action, was so complex that it was divided into 4 trials, all overseen by Justice Peter Fraser. In November 2018, Bates' first post office was on, and all gloves were off. From the get-go, Post Office Limited attempted to have evidence restricted. For once, they were on the back foot. Their attempts were futile though, and the secrets began pouring out. It turned out that Post Office Limited had not one, but 4 different ways of remotely accessing Horizon computers in branches around the UK. Yet, they had repeatedly gone on record to say they had no way of remotely helping sub-postmasters. In fact, when a Horizon bug was discovered in 2010, computers were secretly remotely accessed to fix it. Post Office Limited was so disinterested in helping their staff that a helpline operator even instructed one sub-postmaster to simply adjust her numbers, an illegal practice otherwise known as false accounting that dozens of sub-postmasters ended up being prosecuted for. 3 months after the first trial finished, Justice Peter Fraser handed down his judgment and ruled in favor of the sub-postmasters. He called out the quote, "culture of secrecy and excessive confidentiality within the post office, and the fact that they were trying to hide evidence of how Horizon actually worked." Alan Bates, the other sub-postmasters and their supporters were ecstatic. It was only the first trial, but this victory brought so much vindication and hope. Trial 2 focused on the forensic examination of the Horizon system and whether or not it functioned properly. Fujitsu insider and whistleblower Richard Roll was cross-examined over 2 days as he once again detailed Horizon's remote access capabilities. Then, in the middle of the trial, in a moment of desperation, Post Office Limited pulled another trick. They asked Justice Peter Fraser to recuse himself as the trial judge due to bias. This move was designed to disrupt the momentum of the lawsuit as well as drive up legal costs on the Alliance's side. Post Office Limited also filed an appeal to overturn the first judgment, but thankfully, both applications were refused. The judgment for Trial 2 was due to be handed down in December 2019, but in another twist, Post Office Limited suddenly announced they would be settling. Just like that, it was all over. Tens of millions of pounds in legal fees and 2 decades of cover-ups later, it all ended in a settlement amount of £58 million. However, many claimants were left disappointed. Post Office Limited didn't settle out of the goodness of their heart. The sub-postmasters legal team believed that if the trial had played out to the end and they won, Post Office Limited would have been liable for far more and would have also had to cover their legal costs. Even though there was now proof that Horizon was faulty, and Post Office Limited knowingly falsely prosecuted hundreds of its own employees, they never had to admit any liability. Alan Bates personally didn't want to accept the settlement, but as he was representing 550 others, he decided the least risky move would be to accept. After paying £46 million in legal fees, the claimants would receive less than £22,000 each. In April 2021, the Court of Appeal overturned the convictions of 39 sub-postmasters, including Joe Hamilton, Seema Misra, Harjinder Butoi, Janet Skinner, and Siobhan Sayer. The judgment was met with cheers outside the Royal Court of Justice. To date, 86 former sub-postmasters have had their wrongful convictions quashed, and many more will undoubtedly have their names cleared over the years. During this appeal process, yet another damning document, known as the Clarke Advice, surfaced. It was dated July 2013 and was official legal advice written by external barrister Simon Clarke, who was working with Post Office Limited at the time. It detailed how a Fujitsu engineer named Dr. Gareth Jenkins had been aware of Horizon bugs as early as 2010, but failed to disclose this information in any of his expert witness statements. Simon Clarke's advice was to, quote, disclose the existence of the bugs to those defendants, where the tests for disclosure is met. In short, Post Office Limited was told back in 2013 that they were in breach of its duties as a prosecutor. Post Office Limited began to hold weekly meetings to discuss Horizon errors and how to properly disclose them, as advised by Simon Clarke. However, it soon came to Clarke's attention that something else unbelievably illegal was going on. Post Office Limited's head of security ordered that the handwritten and typed up minutes from the meetings be shredded. Clarke advised Post Office Limited that they were once again breaking the rules and told them to review all their prosecutions and let defendants know about the Horizon bugs. So Post Office Limited commissioned a secret investigation into some, not all, prosecutions. By 2014, they knew there were at least 26 convictions that might be dubious, but decided to keep this information away from the Alliance and MPs. It took so long for the Clarke advice to surface due to attorney-client privilege, but it was once again clear-cut evidence that Post Office Limited had been covering up knowledge of Horizon bugs for years. An independent public inquiry commenced in September 2021, and with it came greater power to subpoena documents and compel witnesses to give evidence. Eleanor Scheich, a campaigner for the sub-postmasters, submitted a Freedom of Information request and discovered a Post Office security team compliance form. On this form, internal investigators were asked to categorize sub-postmasters by ethnicity and included a racial slur that YouTube definitely won't allow us to repeat. Investigators then made recommendations for prosecutions based on these categories. Post Office Limited admitted this form was used between 2008 to 2011. In February 2023, current Post Office CEO Nick Reed and other high-level staff members awarded themselves bonuses for their contributions to the inquiry. Nick Reed's total bonus for the year was £455,000, which included £54,000 for his participation in the inquiry. Sir Wynne Williams, the former judge leading the independent inquiry, publicly reprimanded the payment of bonuses, and in August, Nick Reed returned the £54,000. Meanwhile, only 4 of the 86 former sub-postmasters who had their convictions quashed had received their full compensations. As of November 2023, nobody at Post Office Limited or Fujitsu has resigned or been fired. There has been pretty much zero individual accountability. Between 1999 and 2015, over 700 sub-postmasters were wrongly prosecuted for theft, fraud, and false accounting. The full details of every legal proceeding in this decades-long scandal are too long and complicated for this video, but it's been an uphill battle since the beginning. In September 2023, the UK government announced that every single wrongly convicted post office operator would receive £600,000 in compensation in addition to having their legal costs covered within reason. Anyone who had already received their initial compensation that was less than £600,000 would be paid the difference. Sadly, many innocent sub-postmasters never got the chance to get their names cleared or to see how everything played out. 60 former post office workers died, while the various investigations and court proceedings dragged on over the years. At least 4 suicides have been directly linked to the scandal, and many victims continue to struggle with ongoing mental health ramifications today. When does a dream become a delusion? How many lies do you need to tell others before you start believing them yourself? Carlos Watson had always been a high achiever. His parents both worked as educators at the Florida International University and cultivated a love of learning in their children. Carlos excelled academically, winning a scholarship to one of Miami's most prestigious private schools in grade 7, where he was class president every year and also got his first taste in working in media as editor of the school newspaper. He was accepted into Harvard University and graduated from the School of Government, which led to his roles on various political campaigns in Florida, including managing Bill Clinton's 1992 election day effort in Miami. Carlos then attended Stanford Law School, where he started a few small businesses, renting vending machines and distributing free calendars that contained paid advertising. After graduating from Stanford, he had stints at McKinsey & Co. and Goldman Sachs, before giving up his well-paid corporate job for startup life in the Silicon Valley. He founded Archiva, an educational counseling business, and secured an investment from Laurene Powell Jobs, wife of Apple founder Steve Jobs. Laurene shared Carlos's passion for education, and in 1997, the two co-founded College Track, a non-profit organization that helped poor students prepare for college. Carlos was also making a name for himself as a political commentator, and by the early 2000s, he was making occasional appearances on the American news networks, CNBC and Fox News, before becoming a regular host on CNN, then on MSNBC. He was a natural on TV, and his profile began to rise. In 2012, Carlos and his former associate from Goldman Sachs, Samir Rao, partnered up to ride the wave of digital media platforms that were launching all over the internet. This was the era when we first started streaming our entertainment on Netflix and Spotify, BuzzFeed quizzes and Vice docos became inescapable, and we started reading blogs and articles on sites like Mashable, Vox, and Gawker. Carlos and Samir wanted to create their own millennial-targeted content that was different to what was already out there. They wanted to discover the next big things and be the one to launch them. Up-and-coming artists, writers, brands, etc. They wanted the platform to be sophisticated and more political and business-minded too. Carlos and Samir named their company Ozymedia after the famous poem by Percy Shelley, Ozymandias, which is generally interpreted as a cautionary tale about big egos and letting power get to one's head. Ozymedia needed money to get started, but fortunately, its CEO Carlos had connections in high places and a talent for getting potential investors to believe in his vision. He called Ozy, quote, the new and the next, and proclaimed that it would be the Apple or Oprah of digital media. His resume, his experience, his charisma all helped him secure a number of high-profile investors, including billionaire philanthropist Laurene Powell Jobs, co-owner of the Milwaukee Bucks basketball team, Mark Lazary, Google and Facebook angel investor Ron Conway, and German publishing conglomerate Axel Springer. With this cash injection of tens of millions of dollars, Carlos was able to assemble a small team of web developers, writers, and media producers. Their job was to create a library of content prior to Ozy going live. Carlos had experience in politics, finance, and as a television broadcaster, but he had never run a newsroom before and had zero actual journalism experience. On top of expecting his staff to write dozens of articles every week, he also wanted to produce podcasts and videos. Eugene Robinson, Ozy's former editor-at-large and first ever employee, would later write about the early days leading up to the website's launch. Like many startups, the operation was a bit scrappy. Carlos would pay Eugene with checks out of his personal checkbook. The small team of writers and editors were expected to work long hours, 7 days a week. Eugene even recalled working for 24 hours straight sometimes. Carlos was also prone to fits of rage. He would scream and bang his fists on desks, and regularly threaten to fire people and dock pay. On a business trip to London, Eugene was instructed to book himself into the cheapest hotel he could find. Meanwhile, Carlos stayed with former British Prime Minister Tony Blair. The only thing that kept the team going was the freedom they had to write about almost any story or topic they wanted, as long as it wasn't widely covered in mainstream publications. Carlos embraced offbeat and creative ideas. his main backer, Lorene Powell Jobs, as well as the heads of other cool, successful brands, were always in and out of the office. These high flyers believed in Carlos, so no one else questioned him. Carlos's connections and credibility were legit, so people continued to put up with the working conditions, believing Ozzy would be able to make a real difference in the world. Ozzy went live in September 2013 and was an immediate hit, according to Carlos at least. He would track their traffic stats on a whiteboard in the office, and it apparently only took a couple of years for Ozzy to reach an audience of millions. Even if the numbers seemed a little too high, the staff didn't have any doubts, mostly because they were too busy to be questioning if their boss was lying about the stats, but also because he was bringing in some pretty impressive media partners like National Geographic, The New York Times, and Wired. He also had his own segment on an NPR show. Carlos was also regularly invited to speak at universities and seminars. He continued to act as the public face of Aussie media, but behind the closed doors of the office, staff were hating their lives. Carlos and Samir's demands were difficult to meet, and so the staff turnover rate was very high. One of Carlos's assistants quit after just 1 week. It was virtually impossible for Ozzy to build a positive company culture, but this didn't seem to matter to Carlos very much. As long as he was getting his face and his story out there, he was happy. His dream had always been to have his own talk show, and he was willing to say and do whatever it took to make that happen. So Aussie media was obviously a highly toxic work environment, but I wouldn't be telling you this story if there wasn't some scamming involved. Yeah, the fake it till you make it approach is not uncommon amongst Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, but Carlos did a lot more than just bend the truth a little. One of Aussie's revenue streams was through sponsored content. For example, as a part of a deal they had with major American bank JP Morgan Chase, Ozzy would publish a series of articles about business and finance that would carry the bank's branding. They had similar partnerships with Amazon and Visa too. Ozzy would then have to report their traffic stats to the sponsor. Except, the vast majority of Ozzy's traffic was non-human and generated by a dodgy third-party service that automatically and repeatedly redirected traffic to the sponsored content. Ozzy also used another third-party service to push their sponsored content through to people in a pop-up window that would stay hidden behind the main browser window. Ozzy would then report the illegitimate traffic stats to their sponsors as real, organic views. In 2017, BuzzFeed News exposed Ozzy as well as a slew of other prominent digital publications for this practice that violated ad industry standards and could be considered fraud. Ozzy managed to brush it off without too much incident, but after they stopped using the third-party traffic redirection services, their stats fell significantly. In 2016, Ozzy expanded into events and launched the annual Ozzy Fest in New York City. It was described as TED Talks meets Coachella meets South by Southwest. Every year, it would boast a somewhat random lineup of famous figures, from politicians Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, and Jeb Bush, to comedians Michael Che and Michelle Wolf, musicians Jason Derulo and Passion Pit, and other familiar faces like Mark Cuban, A-Rod, Martha Stewart, Malcolm Gladwell, and Dr. Oz. Told you, it was random. These celebrities would convene on stage and discuss the future of XYZ topics, while various food trucks and other vendors would sell their overpriced goods, and at the end of the day, there would be musical performances. Ozzy Fest was just another revenue stream and another way for Carlos Watson to align himself with famous people. Carlos claimed Ozzy Fest drew a sold-out crowd of 20,000 people, even though the venue, Central Park's Rumsey Playfield, had a capacity limit of 5,000 people. According to a former employee, Ozzy had discounted tickets heavily to the point of giving them away for free, and still could only muster up a crowd of just 2,000 people. In 2017, Ozzy Osbourne and his wife Sharon Osbourne sued Ozzy Fest for trademark infringement, claiming that Ozzy Fest and its branding were too similar to their heavy metal music festival, Ozzfest. They ended up settling, and Carlos said on a CNBC morning program,
"Fun fact, our friend Ozzy and Sharon sued us briefly.
Did they?
And then we decided to be friends, and now they're investors in Ozzy."
It's spelled differently. Oh, they're investors now.
Now they're investors, are part of the family.
In 2018, the Ozzy Fest promos teased a special mystery headliner, but when it was time for their appearance on the day, they dropped out at the last minute with no explanation, and it was never revealed who it was. In 2019, Ozzy Fest was going to be bigger and better than ever. It was announced in May that it would be moving to the much larger venue of Central Park's Great Lawn and would be welcoming 100,000 attendees. Ozzy spent $2 million advertising the event. They needed to aggressively market the festival, as it was happening in just 2 months. John Legend would be headlining, Trevor Noah was going to perform a comedy set, and Barbara Corcoran and Mark Cuban would be listening to business pitches. Except, the New York City Buildings Department only granted Ozzy Fest a license for 15,500 people per day, as reported by Forbes magazine. The Central Park Great Lawn, a public space, generally only allows free or mostly free events, so Ozzy Fest was required to give out half of their tickets free of charge. On one of Ozzy Fest's ads, a photo from a totally different, unaffiliated event was used, the 2018 Global Citizen Festival. When Ozzy got called out for this, they blamed the mistake on an intern. Forbes reported that Trevor Noah never agreed to perform. He was only going to appear on a panel. It was also reported that the Ozzy team would tell celebrities about other celebrities that would be on the lineup to make the event seem more prestigious and credible, then lie about so-and-so celeb dropping out of the event even though they were never part of it in the first place. The weekend of the festival was also forecast to be extremely hot, and no shade or other sun protection measures had been ordered. According to Forbes magazine sources, the 2019 Ozzy Fest would have cost about $6 million, not including its advertising campaign and talent fees. It was shaping up to be Fyre Fest 2.0. However, Ozzy Fest got extremely lucky. The heatwave in New York was so intense that the mayor cancelled all of the city's large outdoor events that weekend. Instead of dealing with what would have inevitably been a disaster of a festival, Ozzy claimed its losses on insurance and actually ended up benefiting from the cancellation. In 2019, Ozzy Media announced it had hit 50 million unique monthly users. Ozzy was still pumping out plenty of content, articles, newsletters, podcasts, videos, a lot of which was sponsored. Carlos was also working hard producing and selling TV shows and actually wasn't doing too bad. He signed a multi-million-dollar deal with the public broadcaster PBS. In 2016, he hosted the documentary series The Contenders. In 2017, he hosted a discussion and debate show called Third Rail with Ozzy. And in 2018, he produced a documentary series called Breaking Big. In 2019, Carlos hosted the Hulu original Defining Moments with Ozzy. Then, owned Spotlight, Black Women Own the Conversation on the Oprah Winfrey Network, which won an Emmy for Outstanding News Discussion and Analysis. He was collecting TV credits left, right, and center, but Carlos wasn't really the star of any of these programs. Carlos burned through the company's funds in just a few years producing all those shows. His old friend Laureen Powell Jobs had stopped investing and stepped down from the board in 2019, so he needed a fresh injection of money to continue making his shows. In December 2019, Carlos was in the middle of negotiating a second season of one of his shows with an unnamed cable TV network, and was also in the middle of securing a bank loan. The bank wanted proof of future revenue, so Carlos created a fake contract between Ozzy Media and the cable TV network, and asked the CFO, Tripti Thakur, to sign it. Tripti had been in the job less than a year and was horrified when Carlos presented her with a fake contract with a forged signature. She immediately resigned and told Carlos what he was doing was a felony. Carlos ignored her warning. When the bank asked to speak directly with the TV network, Samir Rayo created a fake email address with the name of the real network executive and sent emails back and forth with the bank. In mid-2020, Ozzy Media launched The Carlos Watson Show. It would be a talk show with Carlos front and center as the host, interviewing a range of high-profile guests, mostly via Zoom. Carlos hired veteran talk show producers Brad Bessey and Heidi Clements to help bring his vision to life. he and his right-hand man Samir constantly harped on about how the show would be on the cable channel A&E during prime time, but at no point did Brad or Heidi ever communicate with anyone from A&E. Although they thought it was unusual, Aussie Media had produced a special for A&E that year, so they didn't question it too much. All the guests that would appear on the Carlos Watson show were also told that it would end up airing on A&E to 95 million households. However, it eventually became clear to producers Brad Bessey and Heidi Clements that this show was not going to be on A&E, nor was it ever going to be. Brad and Heidi resigned, and in a farewell Zoom call with the rest of the show's staff, they revealed to everyone the truth. Carlos jumped in and clarified that the show was actually going to be a YouTube original and was being paid for by YouTube. After that Zoom call, Carlos constantly reiterated to the people working on the show that it had been sold to YouTube. But of course, it had not. The episodes were uploaded to YouTube like any video, but was certainly not produced in conjunction with YouTube. It was just such a weird lie to maintain, seeing as anybody could go onto YouTube and see very clearly that it was not a YouTube original. Then there was the show's marketing campaign. Billboards, posters, bus ads, and print ads went up across Los Angeles and New York City. All of them featured incorrectly attributed quotes. This ad that called Carlos Anderson Cooper Meets Oprah was apparently from the LA Times, except it wasn't the words from a review. It was from an ad Aussie ran on the LA Times website. This quote, attributed to Deadline, calling Carlos the best interviewer on TV, was actually said by none other than Aussie COO Samir Rayo, who was quoted in a Deadline article. It gets worse. According to this ad, Good Morning America referred to the Carlos Watson show as the fastest growing talk show in YouTube history. But this is how it was said.
Now the fastest, do I have this right, the fastest growing talk show in YouTube history. How are you pulling this off? What's the formula?
The host was repeating back to Carlos his own words. If you actually take a look at the episodes of the show on YouTube, the views to likes and comments ratio is way off. For example, the most viewed video with 4.2 million views only has 200 something likes and a handful of comments from the year it was actually uploaded. That's because Carlos pulled the same trick as he did with the sponsored articles back in 2017. He paid for entire episodes of his show to run as pre-roll ads all over YouTube. The ads that play right before the video you clicked on, that you can skip or sometimes not skip. And those views evidently counted as actual views on the video. The Aussie Instagram page also appears to have bought its following of over 400,000, as most posts from the time only managed to get about a dozen likes and hardly any comments. You may have also noticed that the ads say the show is available on Amazon Prime Video, implying that it was a series made for Amazon. This was not the case. The episodes had actually been uploaded to Amazon Video Direct, a platform that allows anyone to upload their content for free, but does have a loose approval process. Aussie actually got in trouble with Amazon for violating promotion guidelines and had to take the ads down. All of this fakery was just an attempt to make Aussie look attractive to investors and lenders. By April 2020, Aussie had reportedly raised over $80 million and valued itself at $159 million. It projected that it would be worth $5 billion in 2025. In January 2021, Aussie announced that it had hit profitability and brought in over $50 million in revenue in the past year, growing by 50% year over year for 4 years. In February 2021, Carlos and Samir were on a conference call with Goldman Sachs. They had spent the last couple of months negotiating a $45 million investment from the firm. Also on the call was head of unscripted programming for YouTube Originals, Alex Piper. Aussie's biggest selling point was the hugely successful YouTube-funded Carlos Watson show. After all, it was the fastest growing talk show on the platform and had already made $6 million in revenue. Alex Piper was on the call to confirm all this information to Goldman Sachs. Except Alex's voice sounded a bit funny during the call, a bit robotic, and he seemed to be a bit mixed up about some personnel details. The potential investors decided to call him back to clarify a few things. Alex answered the phone confused. He had no idea who these people from Goldman Sachs were, and he certainly was not just on a conference call with any of them. For the last couple of months, Carlos and Samir had been impersonating Alex Piper with yet another fake email address. It's hard to understand why a bunch of investors from Goldman Sachs didn't think it was weird that a senior executive from YouTube used a Gmail address, but they obviously bought it up until the conference call. During that call, Samir Rayo had used a voice-changing app on his phone and impersonated Alex. Carlos was next to him texting him what to say. Samir, as fake Alex, accidentally referred to Ozzy as us a few times. Plus, his voice sounded strange, so the potential investors sensed something was amiss. They tracked down Alex's real contact details and called him back, only to discover that the real Alex Piper didn't have anything to do with Ozy Media. This was the beginning of the end. Carlos had to apologize to Goldman Sachs and admitted it was the COO Samir Rayo on the phone. He explained that Samir had a mental health crisis and was now in recovery. Weirdly, Ozy's board members believed the story. Mark Lazary, co-owner of the Milwaukee Bucks basketball team and chairman of the Ozy board, released a statement. The board was made aware of the incident, and we fully support the way it was handled. Carlos and his team showed the kind of compassion we would all want if any of us faced a difficult situation in our own lives. Goldman Sachs also seemed to accept the explanation. However, the security team at YouTube were not impressed and alerted the FBI. In September 2021, the New York Times published an article written by Ben Smith about the impersonation incident and Ozy's pattern of fraud. Ben actually sort of knew Carlos. He had been the editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed News in 2019 when BuzzFeed was in talks to acquire Ozy Media. After the article came out, a wave of other very damning exposés were published revealing the details of Ozy's toxic work environment and dodgy practices. Ozy's board of directors launched an investigation before most of them stepped down from the company entirely. Sharon Osbourne said Carlos straight up lied about her and her husband becoming investors and called him, quote, the biggest shyster I've ever seen in my life. Advertisers pulled their spends, and less than a week after the New York Times piece came out, Ozy Media announced it was shutting down. A few days later, Carlos went on the CNBC morning show Squawk Box to refute some of the allegations that had been made against him. Then went on the Today Show to announce that Ozy would be back. He claimed that he wasn't on the infamous conference call with Goldman Sachs and was not aware that Samir Rayo impersonated Alex Piper. Ozy.com remains online today, but only offers a curated selection of its original content. In February 2023, Carlos Watson was arrested at a Manhattan hotel and charged with conspiracy to commit securities fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud, as well as aggravated identity theft. He is facing a maximum of 37 years in prison. At the arraignment in March 2023, Ozy's legal representation didn't show up and a public defender had to be assigned at the last minute. Journalists outside the courthouse in Brooklyn reported that the public defender was trying to ask them what the case was even about. Carlos Watson pleaded not guilty and will face trial in May 2024. His co-conspirators Samir Rayo and Ozy's former chief of staff, Susie Hahn, were also arrested but both pleaded guilty. I can't help but feel a little bit of pity for Carlos. His intentions seemed noble enough at the start, and he definitely worked hard. Somewhere along the way, he just got a little too desperate for fame and to hang out with the rich and powerful, i.e. the people he duped. It's hard to feel too sorry for the billionaire venture capitalists and corporate advertisers that he lied to. Sure, random celebrities like Matt Damon who appeared on his talk show were tricked into it, but at the end of the day, it was just a half-hour Zoom call. The real victims in this story are the 75 Ozy Media employees who were left suddenly without a job, as well as the 1,000 or so former employees who believed they were making a difference creating content that would amplify underrepresented voices, except now probably leave Ozy Media off their resume.
Nidhi Razdan, a prominent TV journalist in India, was about to give up her successful 20-year-long career. While her passion for delivering independent news never wavered, she was beginning to suffer from burnout and was sick of the endless trolling she received online. Then, an email that would change her life, an invitation to work at Harvard. Nidhi thought it was a dream come true and couldn't wait to begin the next chapter of her life. But was it too good to be true? Nidhi Razdan, A seasoned journalist in her early 40s, was at the peak of her career. She had worked hard for over 2 decades and was now the anchor of New Delhi TV's Primetime Bulletin, an independent news channel in India. She had amassed 1 million Twitter followers and was a well-known face in India. But 2019 had been a difficult year. The pressure of covering national elections and increasing political unrest had taken a toll and also made her and many other independent journalists the target of relentless trolling and harassment. Nidhi realized she needed to make a change. On the 14th of November 2019, Nidhi received an email that she thought was the answer to her problems. The sender introduced herself as Melissa Reeve. She was a student at Harvard University who was organizing a media seminar at the prestigious school and was hoping Nidhi could give a presentation. Intrigued, Nidhi sent a few emails back and forth with Melissa, who eventually introduced her to Tasif Ahmed, another Harvard student and organizer of the event. A few email exchanges later, Tasif revealed that there was actually a permanent job opening at Harvard that might be suitable for Nidhi. A quick Google search led her to believe it was a journalist faculty position at the university's extension school, which has hired working journalists in the past. Nidhi was highly experienced in the field, so she felt confident that she would be a strong candidate for the position. Eager to pursue this exciting opportunity, Nidhi followed the steps outlined by Tasif and submitted her resume. She then completed an online interview that took 90 minutes. The questions were all professional and fairly typical. Before she knew it, Nidhi was on the phone with Bharat Anand, a vice provost at Harvard, but they never had a video call. Nidhi advanced through and was asked to provide references. So she asked some colleagues to help out. Each person she enlisted received an official-looking email with a link to upload recommendation letters to harvardcareers.com. Nobody questioned the authenticity of this process. It was now January 2020, just before the world would be flung into chaos. An email from Harvard's HR department had just appeared in Nidhi Razan's inbox. She had gotten the job. Her excitement kept building as she read the email. Her classes would be starting in September, and she was offered a yearly salary of $151,000, which was a significant increase from her NDTV pay. The letterhead, university insignia, and even virtual signatures from the real senior Harvard officials confirmed the legitimacy of the position. The Harvard HR department sent over lengthy contracts and forms for Nidhi to sign. They contained information about everything from her visa and health insurance to the discounts she could get at Boston museums. She willingly shared all the personal information that was asked of her by her new employer, including her passport details, medical records, bank account numbers, and so on. She filled out all the official Harvard paperwork as she pictured her new life as a professor. Little did she know that the forms she was filling out were pulled from Harvard's official website by someone trying to scam her. In June 2020, Nidhi publicly announced that she was leaving NDTV for a new chapter as a Harvard professor. The news generated significant media attention in India, and congratulatory messages flooded in from the country's biggest names, politicians, fellow journalists, and even other TV personalities. Nidhi proudly displayed the official Harvard Twitter handle in her bio, and even appeared on TV with her new designation of Associate Professor. She avidly discussed her plans to teach courses like the ethics of journalism and how to report on foreign policy. When September rolled around, Nidhi was told that her classes were going to be delayed due to the confusion caused by the ongoing global situation, but she would still get paid. Her classes were pushed back to October, then January the next year. Her patience was wearing thin, and she was finally starting to realize that something was wrong. Nidhi Razan had been promised payment from September onward for her new job as a Harvard Associate Professor. But weeks, then months passed without a paycheck coming in. The scammers used the global situation many times as an excuse for the delays. Nidhi was understanding at first, but she soon grew frustrated with the seemingly endless administrative process. She was asked to install TeamViewer, a software that allows remote computer access. Wanting to be helpful and cooperative, Nidhi downloaded and installed TeamViewer, unaware that she had just granted scammers unrestricted access to the files on her laptop. Nidhi received multiple invitations to Zoom calls with Emma Dench, the dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Harvard. But the calls would always get cancelled and the excuses grew increasingly absurd. By December, Nidhi was palpably annoyed by what she perceived to be flakiness and lack of organization. She could understand to an extent bureaucracy and red tape and disruptions caused by the global situation, but what she was going through just didn't seem right. Finally, in early January 2021, Nidhi wrote directly to Emma Dench, only to be informed by a confused assistant that there were no Zoom calls scheduled and nobody was aware of Nidhi's new position. Believing there had been some kind of administrative mix-up, Nidhi replied back attaching the numerous emails, documents, and contracts in an attempt to clear things up with the dean. Later that night, Nidhi received an email from the dean's office that made her blood run cold. There is no record of, nor any knowledge of, your name or your appointment. There wasn't even a journalism department at Harvard at all. Panicked, Nidhi sought help from a cybersecurity firm in India. A forensic analysis was conducted on her laptop and devices, and it was revealed that her email had been hacked and malicious software had been installed. Job scams have become a booming industry in India. In 2017 alone, 30,000 people in India fell victim to fake job offers, and the problem was exacerbated by the global situation of early 2020. These scams predominantly target vulnerable young people and recent graduates, luring them with the promise of non-existent jobs, then demanding money for expenses like recruitment fees, equipment, and security deposits. But Nidhi Razdan's case was different. She was a high-profile public figure, and most likely specifically targeted for some reason. It was clear that significant planning and effort had gone into this phishing attack, but bizarrely, the scammers didn't steal any of her money, data, or identity. Nidhi reported the phishing attack to the police. Finding out exactly who was behind the scam was the next challenge. The scammers had strategically purchased HarvardCareer.com from GoDaddy and opted for privacy protection, as that obscured their names from public registries of website owners. They set up a Microsoft email server, enabling them to send messages that appeared to be from Harvard. Nidhi released a statement on NDTV's website, candidly sharing the details of her ordeal. She knew that she would be heavily mocked and criticized for her naivety, but she felt compelled to shed light on her experience. She also handed over every text message, email, and fake document to Harvard, and urged the school to take the matter seriously, as real employees were being impersonated. After Nidhi went public, it soon became apparent that she had not been the only one targeted by these scammers. Whoever the scammer or scammers were, they were very good at covering their tracks. They had created a web of personas across various platforms, Twitter, Facebook, Gmail, and WhatsApp, to pursue their targets for months at a time. And unlike the majority of scam artists, their goal was not financial gain. First, some context to explain why this scam may have taken place. Kashmir is the northernmost region in the South Asia subcontinent, and also the source of long-standing conflict between India and Pakistan. It is a Muslim-majority territory that has been plagued by violence and unrest for decades. In August 2019, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi suddenly revoked Kashmir's autonomy, instantly raising tensions with Pakistan. The Indian government, sensitive to any form of criticism, launched a preemptive crackdown on critics by cutting the internet in Kashmir. On the 5th of August 2019, more than 2,000 influential Kashmiris were thrown in jail, including politicians, business leaders, human rights leaders, and even students as young as 14. It was one of the largest mass arrests of civilian leaders in decades. It was around this time that journalist Rohini Singh received a Twitter DM from a Harvard student. Rohini Singh was another prominent independent journalist in India. She had nearly 1 million Twitter followers and was a contributor to the online publication The Wire. She was also a vocal critic of India's Hindu nationalist government. Tasif Ahmed, the same person who brought up the Harvard job to Nidhi, reached out to Rohini, and they casually chatted about their shared hometown of Lucknow. Then, Tasif invited Rohini to participate in an all-expenses-paid media conference he was organizing at Harvard. He introduced her to another organizer, Alex Hirschman, who emailed her from a Gmail account rather than a harvard.edu address. Taseef and Alex also both used non-US phone numbers. When they asked Rahini for her passport details, she realized it was a scam and promptly broke off communication. After Nidhi Razdan had shared her experience with the public, political commentator Zainab Sikandar realized she had also been targeted by the same scammers. Like the other women, Zainab had written criticisms of the Indian government's actions in Kashmir. In mid-August, she had also received a Twitter DM from Taseef Ahmed with the same offer to speak at Harvard. Zainab sensed that something was amiss and requested a formal invitation from the university. But of course, it never came, so she cut off contact. 2 other women came forward with similar stories. One was a journalist who was interviewed by the New York Times but chose to remain anonymous. She had quickly realized it was a scam when Taseef and Alex both provided UAE phone numbers. In November 2019, Neghet Abbas, a lawyer and government spokesperson, received an invitation from Harvard, but this time, the scammers had upped their game. They had copied email signatures from real Harvard employees and swiped the official letterhead from the university's website. Neghet became suspicious when she was asked for her passport details and other personal information, so she decided to contact Harvard directly. A real Harvard program coordinator responded and told her the invitation was fake. Eager to help catch the scammers, Neghet shared every message, email, and fake document with Harvard and warned others about Taseef and the phishing scam in a video posted on Twitter. It's unclear whether or not Harvard investigated or took any action, because in that same month, Nidhi Razdan was contacted for the first time, and the scammers had ironed out many of the red flags that their previous targets had detected. Around this time, a new Twitter profile popped up under the name Seema Singh. She claimed to be a coder, then later a banker, and regularly tweeted pro-nationalist rants. She also sent bizarre, sexually aggressive messages to Zainab, Neghet, and other high-profile women who spoke out against the government. The discovery of this account led to more speculation that the individual or group behind the Harvard scam was aligned with India's nationalist ruling party and was willing to go to extreme lengths to humiliate critics of the government. Perhaps the scammers could even be backed by the Indian government. Other theories about the scammers' identity suggest involvement from foreign governments. The scammers used UAE phone numbers, and analysis of Nidhi Razdan's computer revealed an IP address once linked to a hacking group associated with Pakistani intelligence. Investigators came across suspicious websites posting as career pages for Ivy League universities, including Harvard, that were registered in China. However, neither Twitter nor Facebook found evidence of state-sponsored involvement when they banned the scammers' fake accounts. GoDaddy, where the harvardcareers.com domain was purchased, declined to identify the customer without a court order. The incidents also raised questions about Harvard's lack of action, even after they were explicitly warned that the scammers were impersonating their staff and students and stealing their official branding. Unfortunately, we have to leave you with an unsatisfying ending this time, as the identities of the scammers still remain a secret. Edward Shin was ambitious. His immigrant father had built a heating and cooling business empire from nothing, and Ed wanted to follow in his father's footsteps. He was an only child and grew up in a mansion in the affluent Orange County in Southern California. His parents were deeply religious, and the whole family was heavily involved in their local church community. Ed excelled academically and in sports. He was one of those guys who seemed to be good at anything they put their mind to. And what Ed wanted more than anything was to be rich and successful. Ed landed a job in investment banking after graduating from UC San Diego in 1999. His career was going well until 2003, when Ed's father James received an email from someone who called themselves Curtis Ransom. The email was in fact a ransom letter. Ed had been kidnapped and was being held on a ransom of $1 million. Ed's parents immediately called the police. For 2 days, police searched for him and the kidnapper. His parents were worried sick, fearing their son could be killed. The matter was escalated to the FBI, who traced the IP address that sent the ransom email back to the Shin mansion.
Ed had been the one who wrote the email and was attempting to extort his own father for $1 million. Ed was never investigated and no criminal case was ever opened. In 2006, Ed went on a holiday to Las Vegas with his wife Karen and their 2 young children. Through work acquaintances, Ed met Joe and Sue Koffenberg, the owners of the long-running sports memorabilia magazine, Legends. Joe was severely sick with cancer and the magazine was becoming too much work for Sue. Ed, who was a big sports fan, offered to buy the magazine for $1 million. The Koffenbergs spent some time with Ed and his family and decided he was a good fit, and they signed off on the deal. Ed took over as publisher, but he never ended up paying the $1 million. The Koffenbergs filed a lawsuit against Ed, but shortly after, an employee of Legends magazine secretly went to Sue to warn her that Ed had hired people to watch their house and was planning to possibly harm them. Sue dropped the lawsuit. In 2008, Ed met tech entrepreneur Joseph Gray at church and they quickly became friends. By now, Ed and his wife had 3 kids with another on the way. Their families hung out often, and Ed and Joe even started a men's Bible study group together. Ed confided in Joe that he, like many Americans at the time, was struggling financially. Joe lent Ed money whenever he needed it, and even asked Ed to work for him at his newest business venture, Lead Generation Technologies, or LG Tech. Ed had impressive ambition and prior experience in finance, so Joe effectively made Ed president of LG Tech. The business would create and air TV ads that targeted people who had debts, credit card, mortgage, student loans, etc. The ad would urge the viewer to call a 1-800 phone number. Then LG Tech would collect the caller's data and sell it to the highest bidder. It was a booming industry thanks to the financial crisis. A few months into his new job, Ed Shin met Christopher Smith, another ambitious guy starting out in the lead generation industry. Chris loved surfing and being out in the ocean more than anything. His friends and family called him a free spirit. He was always seeking adventure and never wanted to follow the crowd. He grew up on a farm in California where he and his brother enjoyed wakeboarding and jet skiing on a private lake on their property. Chris was very close with his family and, like Ed, was very religious. Chris and Ed didn't have much else in common other than their strong Christian faith as well as drive to make lots of money. Chris was hired to work at LG Tech, and he and Ed became something of a dynamic duo. They pretty much became the faces of the business. 2 young, good-looking professionals who were exceedingly talented at finding buyers who would pay big bucks for their leads. They became so good at their jobs that they realized that they didn't need Joseph Gray anymore. In March 2009, Ed Shin secretly started his own rival company, the 800 Exchange, while still working for LG Tech. He partnered up with Chris, giving him just under 50% stake in the company. To give himself a head start on his new venture, Ed stole clients and leads from LG Tech. Ed conducted a lot of business in Las Vegas. He would trawl the conventions for potential clients and impress them with Rolls-Royce Phantoms, giant suites at the Wynn Hotel, and hordes of beautiful, hired women. Ed spared no expense on these Vegas trips. There were even times he flew out on a private jet. He also enjoyed gambling, a lot. This clean-cut, church-going family man was also a degenerate gambler, gambling away tens of thousands of dollars a night. And where did he get all this cash to spend in Vegas? Ed had been skimming his LG Tech sales and depositing the money into his personal bank account. In other words, he was stealing the money. Ed and Chris both officially quit LG Tech before Joseph Gray realized what was going on. Their new venture, the 800 Exchange, was thriving. They were generating 1,500 phone calls per day and making $1 million a month. They hired a few more employees, moved into a larger office, and basked in their success. Ed and Chris made a great team. Ed was ever the professional, while Chris was more casual and brought a fun energy to the office. Chris, still the free spirit surfer at heart, would sometimes surf during the day, then work all night. He didn't trust the government and had a tendency to believe conspiracy theories. He began investing in South African gold coins called Krugerrands, which were worth about $1,000 each at the time. His goal was to get rich, then live on a remote beach where he could surf all day, then work as a bartender by night. With his newfound wealth, Chris would take his brother Paul on surfing trips around the world, and eventually he asked Paul to come work with him at the 800 Exchange. Paul and his wife and 2 kids moved to Orange County, where they became friends with Ed and his family. Ed was still organizing company trips to Vegas, where he'd always pull out all the stops to make them lavish experiences. He hired luxury cars, booked the fanciest suites, and of course, there was the arm candy. Ed's gambling got worse on these trips. There were nights he'd sit at a table for 10 hours, gambling away massive amounts of money. Word about the reckless gambling eventually got back to Joseph Gray, Ed's Bible study buddy and former boss at LG Tech. Joe had been a great friend to Ed over the last year, lending him money and giving him a senior position at his company. He got suspicious about where Ed was getting his gambling money from, so he ordered an audit of LG Tech's financials. Joe's heart sank when he saw the report. The paper trail was clear as day. Ed had embezzled over $2 million from LG Tech and had also poached countless clients. Joe felt betrayed and taken advantage of. He sued Ed in civil court. Ed was ordered to pay Joe back $700,000, but he still had a mountain of gambling debt. Ed had previously sent the Wynn Casino cashier's checks that totaled $220,000, so he took copies of those checks, then edited them to change the payee to LG Technologies. He presented the fraudulent checks to the judge, trying to pass them off as payments to Joseph Gray, but they were rejected. Despite committing fraud and perjury, Ed faced 0 legal consequences from Riverside County. Joe had to go to the county district attorney to finally have a felony embezzlement charge pressed against Ed. In May 2010, Ed was convicted but was only sentenced to probation. He was ordered to pay restitution of $700,000 or he'd go to prison. Chris didn't trust his partner anymore. Ed was now a convicted felon with a huge gambling problem, and Chris was paranoid that Ed would steal from the 800 Exchange to pay his restitution and gambling debts. Ed was the majority partner of the 800 Exchange, and Chris did not have access to their bank accounts. Chris wanted to negotiate a deal with Ed. If Chris could gain access to the company's bank accounts, then Ed could use their money to pay his restitution. Chris hired lawyer Ernesto Aldovar to help with the negotiation as well as for his own protection. On Friday, 4th of June 2010, Chris emailed Ernesto in the early afternoon to let him know that he was meeting with Ed that day. It seemed like they were still a long way off coming to an agreement. But then, at 6:01 p.m., Ernesto received an email update from Chris. I agreed in principle for Ed to buy me out. $700K of the reserve will be paid in 3 installments. When Ed sends details, I will forward and we can discuss. Ernesto then received an attachment outlining an agreement for the quote, good faith payment of $30,000 and 10 gold coins. It was a complete 180 from what Chris and Ernesto had been discussing over the last few months. Chris was suddenly being bought out of the company he had built, and where his brother still worked. On Monday, 7th of June 2010, Ernesto received another email update from Chris. The documents for the buyout were still being prepared, but Chris was leaving for a 3-week trip to South America. That same day, 800 Exchange employees received a message informing them that the office was being cleaned, so they were to stay home for the entire week. Paul Smith was irritated with his brother. Chris was supposed to pick him up from the airport that weekend, but he never showed up and wasn't answering his phone. Paul went into the office to look for Chris. As soon as he opened the door, he was hit with an overwhelming stench of fresh paint, bleach, and cleaning products. The carpet was soaking wet. Ed Shin was inside cleaning. Paul asked him what the hell had happened over the weekend. Ed explained that Chris had gone on a bender and vomited and urinated in the office. Paul noticed a large dark stain inside Chris's office. Ed said that Chris spilled red wine. When Paul asked where his brother was, Ed revealed that Chris had snapped, quit 800 Exchange, accepted a buyout deal, hired a yacht, and took off for an epic South American sailing adventure. Paul was gutted. Why didn't his brother tell him this major news? He wasn't too surprised though. Chris had always expressed disdain for the corporate slog, and he had been feeling especially fed up recently following Ed's legal dramas. Paul was more upset over the fact that he would now have to work at the 800 Exchange without his brother by his side. Chris broke the news to his family via an email. He had thrown his phone out and was going to live off the grid for a new life of freedom and adventure. He was planning to sail and surf around South America and visit the Galapagos Islands. He had broken up with his girlfriend over a text message, and his new traveling companion was Playboy model Tiffany Taylor. His family was surprised at the suddenness of it all, but this kind of thing wasn't too out of character for Chris. Over the next few weeks, Chris sent email updates to his family, gushing about his amazing new unplugged life at sea. But weeks then turned into months, as Chris added more destinations to his trip in Africa, Europe, then India. He had ditched his girlfriend, his emails became less frequent, and also began to reveal volatile mood swings. One email would happily recount some amazing experience, but then the next would be a rant blaming his parents for his childhood trauma. Things weren't adding up for Paul. He and his brother had a great childhood and were close with their parents. He also thought it was odd that Chris wasn't visiting surfing destinations. By August, Chris's father Steve, who was an ex-police officer, was getting suspicious. He wanted to test and see if it was really his son writing the emails. So he asked very specific personal questions, like, what lake did you live on as a child? Or, what type of boat did we have? But Chris had the right answers. In October, Paul was in Vegas on a business trip with Ed. It was the usual: cars, gambling, drinks, women. But on this occasion, Paul recognized one of the women who had been hired to hang out with them. She looked so familiar. Then it clicked. It was Playboy model Tiffany Taylor, Chris's sailing companion. Paul was thrilled to see her. "How's Chris?" he asked. "How was the Galapagos Islands?" Tiffany had no idea what he was talking about. She had not gone on a sailing trip and did not know Chris Smith. Soon after this trip, Paul quit the 800 Exchange. In December, Chris emailed his family and told them he was now in South Africa, but he found a gold dealer in Rwanda who would pay a huge markup for his Krugerrands. His emails as of late had taken on a much darker tone. He said he was feeling scared and stressed, and that this had been the worst year of his life. He said he had been feeling suicidal and once again blamed his parents. He told Paul that he had a new business idea and wanted to meet up in February in Costa Rica to discuss it. But February came and Paul didn't hear from Chris. Paul contacted the hotel that they were planning to meet at, but they had no record of a booking under Chris Smith. The family began to grow extremely concerned that Chris fell in with dangerous people who wanted to steal his gold coins. Steve Smith contacted the Overseas Missing Persons Department and was told that Chris's passport had not been used to leave the country at all. The Smith family were beside themselves at this revelation. For months, they had been maintaining hope that Chris was okay and tried to stop their minds from wandering to the worst possibility. Steve was certain that Ed Shin knew something about what was really going on, so he'd packed a digital recorder and gun and made the long drive from Oregon to Orange County to confront Ed. Steve spoke to Ed for about an hour and secretly recorded their conversation. Ed said that because Chris didn't trust the government, he obtained a fake passport in Vegas so he could travel without being tracked. Steve played along, but wasn't buying a word Ed was saying. In April 2011, Steve officially reported Chris missing to Laguna Beach PD. In June, a full year since Chris first disappeared, Ed Shin was brought in for questioning. He told the detectives the full story about how he and Chris got into business together and how Chris would sometimes go on benders in the office. He told them about the buyout and how he had been wiring Chris installments to different countries. Ed even offered to show detectives his bank records, but the detectives never followed up. They didn't seem to seriously consider him as a suspect. Meanwhile, Laguna Beach PD weren't the only ones looking into Chris Smith's disappearance. Joe DeLue was a former police officer who was now working as a private investigator. The property manager of his office building reached out one day and asked him to look into a tenant who had vacated a neighboring office without paying $40,000 in rent. The tenant was Ed Shin. The 800 Exchange had recently gone belly up, and its founder was running from many vendors demanding payments. When Joe DeLue discovered that his target was being investigated by former colleagues at Laguna Beach PD in a missing persons case, he realized that something very sinister was going on. He reached out to Steve Smith, who by now was frustrated with the lack of answers from the police. So the two ex-cops decided to conduct their own investigation together. Joe examined every single email Chris had supposedly sent. When he came across Steve's email querying about the lake and boat from his childhood, he saw that Chris had actually gone and emailed his brother Paul separately to fish for the answers to the questions. A computer forensic analyst was hired and determined that all of Chris's emails had been sent out of California. Joe was allowed into the former office of the 800 Exchange, which had been sitting vacant for about a year now. He scanned every inch of the place and found what he believed was a small blood spatter on a doorframe. He had what he needed and contacted the Orange County Sheriff's Department, suspecting that a murder may have taken place in the office. A forensic team sprayed the office with luminol, a substance that would expose any traces of blood when the lights were switched off. And lo and behold, glowing spatters showed up all over the walls and ceiling. The carpets were ripped up to reveal large blood stains on the floor. The blood was tested against DNA samples taken from Chris's parents, and it was a match. Analysis of the blood splatter pattern on the walls and ceiling suggested that the victim was struck forcefully several times from above. In August 2011, Ed Shin was pulled off a plane at Los Angeles International Airport. He was trying to leave the country and go to Canada, which was a violation of his probation. He was arrested and taken to Orange County Sheriff's Office. Thinking he was in trouble for violating his probation, during questioning, Ed eventually brought up Chris Smith. The detectives played dumb and let Ed recount the story of how Chris went on a bender in the office before accepting the buyout deal and sailing off to South America. He explained how he had to close the office to clean up Chris's vomit and urine and red wine spills, unaware of the mountain of evidence that had been collected against him. An hour into the interview, the detectives dropped the act and told Ed that they knew it was Chris's blood that he was actually cleaning up. Ed said he had nothing to do with it and asked for a lawyer, ending the interview. 30 minutes later, Ed said he'd talk. He confessed that there had been a violent fight on the night of June 4th, 2010. Chris did die in the office, but Ed didn't kill him.
We were throwing blows, and that's when I jumped up, and he jumped up on the desk, and we kind of almost like two rams collided on his desk. And, it's probably where the blood got on the ceiling because, somehow I was throwing him up and he probably smeared.
Did you catch that? Ed let out a laugh as he recounted the story of how his friend and business partner supposedly died. He detailed how their fight escalated and how they began lunging at each other, and in the chaos, Chris hit his head, hard, on the edge of the desk. Ed then said he paid a Russian man to dispose of Chris's body while he got to work cleaning up. He claimed he had no idea where Chris's body was. Ed's phone records were analyzed. On June 7th and 9th, 2010, cell phone tower pings placed Ed in a remote desert town called Boulevard, which was hundreds of miles away, close to the Mexico border. The area was searched thoroughly, but Chris's body or murder weapon were never found, meaning the cause of death could not be certain, and Ed's story about the fight could not be definitively disproved. In November 2018, Ed Shin's trial finally began. It had been 7 agonizing years since he was first arrested. Despite a lack of body or murder weapon, Ed was charged with first-degree murder. The key piece of evidence to prove the murder was premeditated was the email sent to Ernesto Aldovar at 6:01 p.m. on the 4th of June 2010, the night of Chris's death. The prosecution argued that the buyout email and attached agreement detailing the good faith payment were perfectly written and showed no signs of panic, meaning it had been written before Ed met up with Chris. A handwriting analysis of the agreement found, quote, indications that the questioned signature was not produced by the same writer. Ed had prepared the email and forged agreement ahead of time as he was planning to murder Chris. He then took Chris's share of the company and his gold to pay the restitution and avoid going to prison. Ed took to the witness stand and explained that Chris had also been embezzling money from LG Technologies back in 2009, and when Ed threatened to turn him in, Chris snapped and attacked him. Ed once again recounted the violent fight he had with Chris. When he was asked why he didn't have any cuts or bruises, Ed didn't have an answer. When asked why he didn't call 911 after Chris hit his head, Ed simply replied he was in shock. When asked what he was doing near the Mexico border on 2 separate occasions, he said he was planning to leave the country for a fresh start, but changed his mind and turned back as he couldn't bear to leave his wife and 4 kids. When asked about the many emails he sent to the Smith family posing as Chris, he admitted he wrote them all and intended to lead the family into believing Chris took his own life. It took the jury less than an hour to reach a verdict. Ed Shin was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Even though he would be spending the rest of his life behind bars, Ed reiterated in subsequent TV interviews that he didn't know where Chris's body was hidden and refused to give details about the supposed Russian man who disposed of the body. Ed also never once mentioned his family, and it is unclear if he still has a relationship with them.
94,000 stolen Bitcoin worth $3.6 billion were recovered by the US government in early 2022. It was the largest financial seizure in US history. The hunt for the stolen Bitcoin had taken over 4 years, and the thieves were not the typical crypto criminals. It wasn't a sophisticated network of state-sponsored hackers from North Korea or Russia. The perpetrators were actually a young married couple living in a messy apartment in number 75 Wall Street, just a short distance from the offices of one of their investigators. The apartment was raided and feds found $40,000 in cash, an assortment of foreign currencies, hollowed out books, fake passports, 50 tablets, encrypted USB sticks, and a bag labeled burner phone. They found a Bengal cat named Clarissa, and finally, her owners, the cringiest couple on the internet. Heather Rhiannon Morgan was born in 1990 and grew up in a tiny rural town in California called Tehama. It is located over 100 miles north of Sacramento and has a population of just 400 people. In school, Heather didn't have many friends, and she was often teased about her speech impediment. However, she was known for being intelligent and was gifted in maths and science. In high school, she studied Japanese and embarked on an exchange program to Japan. From an early age, she longed to get as far away from her hometown as she could. In 2011, Heather graduated with an economics degree from the University of California, Davis in Sacramento, before moving to Hong Kong and then Cairo, Egypt for her postgraduate studies. She began telling people she was Turkish and that her name was Heather Reyhan. She was described by her former professor and then co-author as a fast learner with a quick mind. It was clear she had a lot of ambition and deliberately surrounded herself with like-minded, successful people. In YouTube videos, Heather talked about her humble origins and revealed that she had been broke and homeless multiple times in her life. In early 2013, Heather moved to Silicon Valley, where her interests shifted away from economics. she landed a job as head of business development at a Middle Eastern gaming startup called Tamatem, which was part of a global business accelerator course called 500 Startups. It was through this intensive 4-month program that Heather would brush shoulders with some of the biggest players in Silicon Valley and meet equally driven and talented entrepreneurs. Founders and employees from 30 tech startups would attend classes and work in their offices for 18 hours a day. Heather stood out at 500 Startups. She was quirky and never shy. She also was just that bit hungrier than her peers, and gave the impression that she would do whatever it took to succeed. 3 months into the program, Heather dropped out. Her peers then received some surprising news. Heather was now married and living in Brazil. It turned out she had jumped at the opportunity to work for a Brazilian startup called PinMyPet and ended up marrying one of the founders, Bruno de Souza. However, the relationship didn't last, and she moved back to the Bay Area at the end of 2013, where she reconnected with a fellow 500 Startups alum, Ilya Lichtenstein. Ilya Dutch Lichtenstein was born in 1988 in Russia and moved to a wealthy neighborhood in Chicago with his parents at a young age. He remained a Russian citizen. Like Heather, Ilya excelled academically and was particularly talented in maths and science. He didn't travel as far from home though, graduating with a psychology degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In 2011, Ilya moved to Silicon Valley and co-founded MixRank, which was a tool that allowed companies to spy on their competitors' online display ads. MixRank was doing well and several notable investors were on board, including Mark Cuban. Heather and Ilya began an on-again, off-again relationship in 2014. By this point, Heather had also founded her own startup, SalesFolk, which helped businesses and individuals write cold email templates. In February, Heather and Ilya traveled to Hong Kong together, flying in first class. According to Ilya's LinkedIn page, he became an advisor at SalesFolk. In January 2015, Ilya opened an account at an unnamed virtual currency exchange referred to as VCE5. Virtual currency exchanges are online businesses that allow customers to trade cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin for other assets, including conventional money and other cryptocurrencies. Ilya verified this particular account with his email address, a copy of his California driver's license, and an ID photo. In May 2016, Ilya abruptly left MixRank, his own startup. His employees found this baffling, as the business was growing steadily. 3 months later, Bitfinex, one of the largest cryptocurrency exchanges at the time, was hacked and almost 120,000 Bitcoins were stolen. On the 2nd of August 2016, an unknown individual or group located in Hong Kong discovered a flaw in the code of the cryptocurrency exchange website, Bitfinex. In just under 4 hours, 119,754 Bitcoin was stolen, nearly half of Bitfinex's entire inventory, worth about $72 million at the time. As you may know, over the next few years, crypto would explode and the value of Bitcoin would skyrocket. The stolen Bitcoin's value would rise to a staggering $8.3 billion at the peak of the crypto boom in 2021. Immediately after the hack, users reported that the Bitfinex website was broken. Once they were able to access their accounts, many users discovered that their Bitcoins had disappeared from their wallets. 4 days later, Bitfinex announced that the coins were gone and that the losses would be generalized across all accounts at a percentage of about 36%. In layman's terms, every single account holder on Bitfinex would lose 36% of all their money, not just victims of the hack. Then, instead of refunding customers, Bitfinex distributed their own digital token known as BFX. Each token was given a $1 value. As soon as BFX hit the open market, the value plummeted to just 20 cents, and customers were not able to sell them off fast enough to recoup their losses. Before we check back with Heather and Ilya, a quick crash course on crypto. A cryptocurrency is essentially a virtual currency designed to act as money and a form of payment outside the control of any person, group, or entity. In other words, decentralized.
But this doesn't mean you can't be completely untraceable when buying or selling with crypto. A blockchain is an open and shared digital ledger where every single crypto transaction is recorded. The data on the blockchain can never be modified or erased and is also viewable by anyone. Crypto is stored in virtual wallets. These wallets and their contents can be viewed on the blockchain, but their owners can remain anonymous to an extent. The nearly 120,000 bitcoins that were stolen from Bitfinex were flagged by blockchain analysts. So if the thieves were to spend the coins, they would have to find ways to launder it to ensure their identity remained a secret. Investigators located the wallet that contained the stolen Bitcoin on the blockchain fairly easily, but had a much more difficult time uncovering the owner of the wallet. In 2017, Heather claimed that SalesFolk generated $65 million in revenue in the past year, a figure not too far from the amount stolen from Bitfinex. However, former employees told Forbes magazine that that figure was definitely overinflated. SalesFolk apparently only ever had a handful of employees at a time, and their yearly salaries were between only $10,000 and $30,000. Heather and Ilya's relationship became serious when they moved into an apartment on Wall Street together. Their monthly rent was about $6,800. Certainly expensive, but not unheard of in New York City. They appeared to live fairly normal lives for a techie couple in their early 30s. They were career focused and their friends knew they were making good money. But overall, they were pretty down to earth. No flashy cars, oversized mansions, or designer bags. They got a Bengal cat named Clarissa, who they sometimes took around the city in a pram. The one thing they did splurge on was travel. They traveled to Malaysia, Hong Kong, Egypt, Vietnam, and Ukraine together, always flying in first class and staying in 5-star hotels. Both Heather and Ilya were very active online. They both had multiple Instagram accounts, shared their thoughts about crypto and the tech industry on Twitter, and posted regular career updates on LinkedIn. Heather also made hundreds of videos posted across YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok, but more on those later. Heather wrote columns for Forbes and Inc. magazine. She covered topics like digital marketing, entrepreneurship, and cybersecurity. Heather regularly gave presentations about these topics, but she also had a particular interest in the concept of social engineering.
Social engineering is basically, I hate the term manipulating, but it's getting someone to share information or take an action that they otherwise would not, and oftentimes that involves what's called cognitive bias. So basically using things people are already programmed to do and think to trigger them to do what you want them to do. The media often wants us to think that social engineers are bad people, like hackers. And I do actually believe that the ends justify the means sometimes, but like, you know, nothing I'm doing, I think my end goals aren't like bad or evil. Like I'm not trying to scam someone out of money or like get someone hurt in any way.
In New York, Heather began creating what she called surrealist art, and her hobbies expanded to taxidermy, graphic design, and decorating her clothes and other household items. Meanwhile, Ilya was working on a new startup called NPass, which was building a secure crypto wallet and password management software. Heather became the CEO of NPass, but the company never released anything beyond generic marketing material. Former employees reported that they never did any work and there was never a product that anyone was working on. Ilya was also running several brand new investment companies that seemed to have a roster of employees and clients with names out of a random name generator. In March 2019, Ilya fired all NPass employees and the company disappeared. Around the same time, Heather quit her own company, SalesFolk, citing burnout, family illness, legal threats, and dishonest employees. Neither Heather nor Ilya got full-time jobs after that. Heather had always posted copiously across her social media channels, but she really stepped it up now that she had seemingly no money worries and plenty of free time. She created outlandish characters and made hundreds of videos. She gave herself nicknames like Charlene, Turkish Martha Stewart, the Crocodile of Wall Street, but her most prolific alter ego was Razzle Khan.
Razzle Khan, the Versace better win, come real far.
On the official Razzle Khan website, she describes herself as Genghis Khan but with more pizzazz. No one knows for sure where this rapper's from. Could be the North African desert, the jungles of Vietnam, or another universe. As Razzle Khan, she danced and rapped in the streets of New York in her homemade Be-Razzled outfits, showed off her bizarre shopping hauls, decorated animal skulls, and performed extremely cringy comedy skits. In July 2019, Ilya and Heather got engaged. The same way the couple lived their lives, the proposal was over the top. Ilya hired a team of designers and guerrilla marketers to create a multi-channel marketing campaign. He had a Razzle Khan poster printed and plastered around New York City. The idea was to follow the posters to Times Square, where 3 massive billboards were lit up with Heather's face. It cost between $5,000 to $50,000 to rent a Times Square billboard for the day. In August 2019, Heather and Ilya went on a month-long trip to Ukraine, but it wasn't purely for leisure. Court documents state that the couple obtained fake Ukrainian passports and IDs, bank cards and SIM cards purchased on the dark web. They were allegedly making preparations for permanent relocation to Ukraine. In November 2021, it was time for the #Razzle wedding in California. Heather wore a gold gown and headpiece and entered the reception sitting in a gold throne carried by half a dozen friends. Razzle Khan stickers were given out as party favors. Heather then got on stage and started performing one of her rap songs, while her bridesmaids waved gold banana leaves. Ilya watched on proudly before getting on stage himself to perform a magic routine. At the end of the night, a bus picked up the bride and groom and their closest friends and drove them to a mansion where bartenders greeted them with drinks and hors d'oeuvres. The after party was even more extravagant than the actual wedding. After that night, the couple's friends started to wonder how they could afford it all. In the years after the 2016 Bitfinex hack, the feds didn't see any activity on the stolen bitcoins. The money just sat there, growing on the blockchain. The bitcoins first started to move in January 2017. Funds were being sent to a retailer on the dark web called Alphabay. The dark web is primarily used by individuals who wish to remain anonymous. Some goods that were commonly sold on Alphabay included narcotics, fake passports and IDs, as well as hacking tools. The thieves use Alphabay to exchange bitcoins for a coin called Monero. Monero operates on its own privacy-enhanced blockchain, which means details of transactions can be hidden. The perfect currency for criminals who want to be untraceable. The thieves also opened a store on Alphabay and processed hundreds of, presumably, fake sales before shutting down. The revenue was then funneled into several different crypto wallets. Every crypto laundering trick in the book was used. One technique was mixing. They would take an assortment of clean cryptocurrency, scramble them with the stolen bitcoins, and redistribute them, so other people would end up with the stolen bitcoins. Another technique was a peel chain. The thieves would create new wallets and peel off small amounts of Bitcoin from the main wallet and deposit them into the new wallets, making the movement of the money harder to track. The thieves were also purchasing gold coins worth tens of thousands of dollars, as well as gift cards from Walmart, Uber, Hotels.com, and PlayStation. In February 2017, Ilya Lichtenstein's verified VCE5 account received a deposit. A month later, 3 more accounts were opened at a different exchange, referred to as VCE7. Over the next 4 years, $2.9 million worth of Bitcoin flowed into these accounts, and nearly all of it was converted into cash and transferred into American bank accounts. In July 2017, Alphabay's owner was arrested in Thailand, and the website was shut down by law enforcement. Alphabay's servers were seized, and suddenly, all of its users who believed they were operating anonymously had their data exposed to the feds. As we know, the Bitfinex thieves utilized Alphabay's services extensively to launder the stolen bitcoins. Gradually, the pieces of the highly complicated puzzle were falling into place. Investigators had been tracking the thieves' activities for 4 years. Every transaction was leading them closer to an identity and arrest. Then there would be one final step, the hard evidence of catching the thieves in possession of the crypto wallets. In 2021,
federal agents began to monitor the apartment building at number 75 Wall Street. Over the course of a year, they would conduct stakeouts, show up in the middle of the night, take the elevator to the roof, and attempt to observe the thieves' online activities so they could be caught red-handed. For 4 years, the thieves were able to keep their identities hidden from the feds, but ironically, they had their lives on full display through their many social media accounts. It was 7 a.m. on the 5th of January 2022 when federal agents raided Heather and Ilya's apartment. Agents from the FBI, IRS, and Homeland Security took the freight elevator up, knocked on the front door, and were let inside. It was imperative that the thieves were caught off guard so they wouldn't have time to lock their electronics or destroy any evidence. As the feds rummaged through the apartment, Heather requested to get their cat Clarissa from the bedroom. As Heather crouched down to fetch Clarissa from under the bed, she grabbed her phone from her nightstand and desperately tried to lock it by repeatedly entering the wrong passcode. An agent saw what she was trying to do and wrestled the phone out of her hands. Altogether, the agents retrieved $40,000 in cash, an assortment of foreign currencies in plastic bags, and another bag labeled burner phone. There were over 50 tablets, phones, encrypted USB sticks, and other electronics in the apartment. They also found fake passports and IDs, and books that had been hollowed out to hide money and electronics. After the raid, Heather continued to post her usual content on Instagram and TikTok, as if nothing happened. But the evidence from the apartment was more than enough to definitively tie the online wallets to the Bitfinex hack. Investigators were able to decrypt several files in Ilya's cloud storage, including one file with a list of passwords. You don't need to be a cybersecurity expert to know how unwise it is to keep private keys to billions of dollars worth of crypto on a cloud drive. Investigators were able to connect the dots and access 94,000 stolen Bitcoin, now worth $3.6 billion. On the 7th of February 2022, Heather Morgan and Ilya Lichtenstein were arrested on charges of conspiracy to commit money laundering and conspiracy to defraud the United States. No one has yet been publicly blamed for the initial hack on Bitfinex, possibly due to lack of evidence. Heather and Ilya are both currently awaiting trial. Ilya has remained in federal custody since his arrest, as his ties to Russia have deemed him as a flight risk. Heather was freed on $3 million bond and is somehow now employed by an unknown tech firm. If convicted, they are each facing up to 25 years in prison. Prosecutors believe the couple still have access to around 25,000 Bitcoins that have yet to be tracked down. They also believe that had the raid been weeks or even just days later, Heather and Ilya may have already jetted off to Ukraine with their laundered fortune. As for the 94,000 recovered Bitcoins, they are still being held by the US government. Bitfinex announced they would be working with the Department of Justice to attempt to recover as much of the Bitcoin as possible, but the refund process will undoubtedly be complicated. BFX tokens were discontinued in April 2017 after they were all bought back by Bitfinex for their full value of $1 per token. Some users had sold off their BFX tokens or opted to trade them for recovery right tokens, which were essentially IOUs in the event the stolen money was recovered. But the fact remains that many Bitfinex customers suffered significant losses and are still waiting to be made whole again.